History Channel. My name is Sophie, and today we're diving into one of the most tumultuous periods in European history, the 100 Years' War. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore the epic saga of this protracted conflict between England and France that reshaped nations, influenced culture, and gave rise to legendary figures like Joan of Arc. So, sit back, relax, and let the whispers of history guide you through the tales of battles, betrayals, and heroism. As we journey back to the 14th and 15th centuries, imagine the clashing swords, the strategic manoeuvres, and the political intrigues that define this era. Whether you're here to learn, relax, or both, I promise you a fascinating exploration of the 100 Years' War. Let's begin. The 100 Years' War, a saga of epic proportions, unfolds before us in three distinct phases, each marked by its own defining characteristics. The Edwardian phase, marked by iconic battles such as Crécy and Poitiers, saw the rise of English longbowmen and the emergence of legendary figures like Edward III and the Black Prince, setting the stage for the ensuing chapters of this grand narrative. Transitioning into the Carolingian phase, a delicate balance between the warring factions gave way to conflicts spilling into new territories, immortalising key figures like John of Gaunt and Bertrand du Guesclin, as well as the strategic manoeuvres of the English chevauchés and the formidable French professional forces in engagements at Courchevel and Bonvalin. The Lancastrian era, culminating in the iconic victory at Agincourt under King Henry V, witnessed the internal strife within France between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, ultimately finding salvation in the form of the indomitable Joan of Arc. Her pivotal role in shifting the tide of the war at Orléans paved the way for Prince Charles to reclaim the throne, leading to decisive victories at Patay, Formigny, and Castillon, marking the triumphant conclusion of this historic conflict and the resurgence of French dominance. The 100 Years' War, a significant conflict in European history, traces its origins back to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. This event led to a complex situation where English rulers held lands in France as vassals of the French monarchs, while also ruling a powerful kingdom. By 1224, all English territories in France had been conquered by the French, except for Gascony in the southwest. Gascony, an important region for England due to its lucrative wine trade, had strong ties to the English crown and little connection to the rest of France. These factors created tensions that ultimately culminated in the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, a prolonged conflict between England and France. Despite attempts at diplomacy, disputes over inheritance and land between the two countries escalated, leading to the development of military capabilities and strategies on both sides. The death of Charles IV of France in 1328 without a male heir sparked a succession crisis, with Edward III of England and Philip of Valois both claiming the throne based on conflicting interpretations of the Salic law, which excluded females from inheritance. The French nobles ultimately chose Philip of Valois as the new king, further fueling the animosity between England and France. This decision, rooted in ancient laws and family rivalries, set the stage for the protracted conflict known as the 100 Years' War, shaping the course of history for both nations. Edward's position was intricately intertwined with both his familial ties and the political landscape of his time. At the outset, he found himself under the influence of Isabella and Roger Mortimer, aligning himself with Philip VI in 1329. However, as he matured, Edward orchestrated a strategic move to remove Mortimer from power and exile Isabella. This bold manoeuvre allowed him to assert his authority and establish his reign over the kingdom, showcasing his newfound autonomy and strength. The year 1333 marked a significant turning point for Edward, as he led a successful military campaign to the north, securing a decisive victory over France's Scottish allies at Halidon Hill. This triumph forced David II to seek refuge in Paris, compelling France to take Scottish interests into account in future negotiations. Faced with increasing tensions with the French monarch, Edward made the controversial decision to offer sanctuary to Robert d'Artois, a French exile. This choice exacerbated the strained relations between Edward and Philip VI, ultimately laying the groundwork for the onset of the 100 Years' War in 1337. The conflict between Edward and Philip VI escalated when the French king declared that Aquitaine was no longer under Edward's jurisdiction, citing his harbouring of Robert Artois as a provocation. This declaration marked the official commencement of hostilities between the two powers, with skirmishes breaking out in Gascony as Edward sought alliances and support in Flanders. The underlying issues of feudal loyalty and centralised governance fueled the ongoing strife, shaping the Edwardian era of Plantagenet rule and setting the stage for the tumultuous events that would define Edward's reign. In a bold move to finance his campaign in France, Edward made the controversial decision to sell England's royal crown, a symbol of the monarchy's power and prestige. With the funds gathered from this sale, he assembled a formidable army of 12,000 troops to confront his adversary, Philip, on the battlefield at Flamangery in October. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Edward displayed remarkable bravery and tactical acumen. The ensuing confrontation resulted in a tense standoff, during which Edward strategically retreated to friendly territory, avoiding a direct confrontation with Philip's forces. This decision ultimately prevented further conflict and allowed Edward to regroup and plan his next move. However, the aftermath of the campaign in 1339 left a trail of devastation in the regions traversed by Edward's army, impacting the local populations and resources. During the medieval period, military strategies often focused on weakening the enemy's infrastructure and resources to destabilise their government and economy. Edward, inspired by the success of such tactics in affluent regions like northern France, devised the ruthless chevauchée. These cost-effective raids were intended to systematically devastate the territories they passed through, disrupting agricultural productivity and undermining the allegiance of the conquered population to their ruler. As Edward implemented this strategy, the effectiveness of these tactics became increasingly apparent in the context of the 100 Years' War, highlighting the brutal realities of medieval warfare and conquest. As the conflict between England and France escalated, Edward faced mounting challenges, including financial strain and the constant threat of French raids on English coastal towns. In response to these threats, Edward proclaimed himself King of England and France in Ghent in 1340, further inflaming tensions between the two nations. The strategic importance of naval power became evident as Edward mobilised reinforcements and converted merchant vessels into warships to bolster his forces. The naval conflict reached a critical point at Sluys, where the English fleet, under Edward's command, faced off against a coalition of French, Castilian and Genoese forces. Edward's decisive actions and naval prowess played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the conflict and solidifying his position as a formidable leader in the ongoing struggle for dominance in Europe. Despite facing facing opposition from his advisors, King Edward III of England displayed remarkable determination when he decided to confront the formidable French armada of 200 ships that were anchored near the Swin River estuary in present-day Belgium. His unwavering resolve to engage in battle, despite criticism of the risky naval attack, demonstrated his strong leadership and courage. The French fleet, led by inexperienced naval commanders, consisted of a diverse range of vessels manned by a substantial number of sailors and soldiers, presenting a formidable adversary. In contrast, the English fleet was smaller in size, but comprised a formidable force of experienced combatants, including skilled men-at-arms and archers. King Edward III, having gathered valuable intelligence about the French fleet's positioning through espionage, strategically planned the attack for the following day to capitalise on favourable circumstances. The English fleet's organised advance in 3 tiers caught the anchored French ships off guard, preventing them from utilising their rear lines effectively. The skilled English longbowmen played a pivotal role in the battle, unleashing a devastating barrage of arrows that caused chaos among the French vessels and incapacitated their crossbowmen. As a result, the French front line faced swift defeat as English troops seized control of their enfeebled ships, leading to a decisive victory for King Edward III and his English armada. The retreat of the Genoese galleys further solidified the English triumph, as the French front line either sank or surrendered, marking a significant triumph for King Edward III and his strategic naval campaign. As the English advanced towards the smaller vessels in the second line, they swiftly gained a significant upper hand over the French. Simultaneously, a fleet of Flemish boats set sail from nearby ports, launching a surprise attack on the French armada from the rear. This unexpected assault proved to be a catastrophic blow to the Valois fleet, further tipping the scales in favour of the English. The battle raged on as night descended, culminating in a devastating defeat for the French forces. Out of the 190 ships lost by the French, only 23 managed to escape in the cover of darkness, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The captured French sailors faced a grim fate, with many meeting their demise either by drowning or at the hands of locals on the shore, resulting in a staggering death toll estimated between 16,000 to 18,000 men. The news of the disaster was reportedly delivered by Philip VI's court jester, highlighting the extent of the tragedy that had befallen the French fleet. In stark contrast, the English emerged from the battle with minimal losses in ships, but significant casualties among their men, solidifying their resounding triumph and dealing a severe blow to French morale. After engaging in campaigns in the Scheldt Valley against the Count of Hainault and Flemish rebels in early 1340, the French army faced a strategic shift towards safeguarding the French borders, particularly focusing on the defence of Arras. King Edward strategically planned a dual offensive with his Flemish and imperial allies, with the aim of decisively striking northern France, leading the larger force towards Tournai for a siege. Edward coordinated a secondary army under Robert d'Artois to Saint-Omer, leveraging his regional alliances. Upon reaching the outskirts of Saint-Omer on July 16th, Robert d'Artois encountered a fortified town, defended by the Duke of Burgundy and Count of Arras-Eudes. The Duke's reinforcements, along with support from the Count of Armagnac, bolstered the defence, presenting a formidable challenge for the besieging forces, with a mix of troops including longbowmen, Flemish soldiers and men-at-arms. Robert d'Artois initiated the siege of Arques, establishing a strategic camp. main French army by the 26th, Robert d'Artois opted to provoke the garrison into open conflict, strategically positioning his forces, with archers in the rear and a reserve contingent at the ready. Robert prepared for a confrontation, despite the Duke of Burgundy's advice to remain within the safety of the walls. A group of eager knights and part of the garrison ventured out to engage the Flemish forces. The ensuing clash saw the Flemish troops effectively utilising their defensive placements to repel the French. However, as the battle unfolded into a chaotic melee, with both sides fiercely contesting the field, the tides of the conflict ebbed and flowed throughout the day. The skirmish showcased the tactical prowess of both the French and Flemish forces, highlighting the intensity and unpredictability of the ongoing conflict. In the midst of the ongoing conflict, the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Armagnac made strategic decisions to join the battle. The Count, flanked by his heavily armoured knights, bravely led a charge against the Flemish forces, dealing a significant blow to their left flank. The Flemish second line soon retreated to their camp, only to be relentlessly pursued and suffer heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the Duke of Burgundy faced off against the English forces on the right flank. Despite an initial advantage, the French men-at-arms were eventually forced to retreat to the safety of their fortifications, resulting in significant losses for the Duke. As night fell and both armies grew weary from the prolonged combat, the English and French forces passed each other, with the English soldiers returning to their camp victorious. The following day witnessed Robert d'Artois rallying his fleeing allies and presenting a comprehensive report to Edward. Subsequently, the French forces advanced towards Tournai, eventually setting up a camp at Bouvines in early September after the intense conflict at Saint-Omer. On a different front, Edward and his allies had besieged Tournai from July onwards, but found themselves unable to breach the city's defences. Rising tensions among Edward and his allies, exacerbated by financial constraints and differing strategic perspectives, eventually led to negotiations that culminated in the lifting of the siege and the signing of the Truce of Esplesia. Back in England, Edward grappled with mounting challenges involving creditors and internal discord, particularly concerning tax collectors and ministers. The 100 Years' War took on a new dimension as the Breton Civil War evolved into a proxy struggle following the death of Duke John III of Brittany. The power struggle between John of Montfort and Charles of Blois for control over the duchy ignited a civil conflict, with Montfort initially seizing territories within the duchy while facing opposition from other feudal lords. The support for each claimant varied among the populace, with merchants and peasants largely favouring John, while the nobility predominantly sided with Charles. During the tumultuous events in the towns of Brittany, the reactions to Montfort's rise varied widely among the populace. Some welcomed him, while others resisted his influence. As the summer drew to a close, Montfort had managed to assert control over a substantial portion of the duchy, causing concern among the French king, who was preoccupied with impending negotiations with the English. Rumours of Montfort potentially aligning with the English monarch prompted the French king to declare support for Charles of Blois, setting the stage for a conflict that would shape the future of Brittany. In the autumn of 1341, a significant French army laid siege to the town of Champtoceau, leading to a fierce confrontation with Montfort's forces. Despite his efforts to relieve the besieged town, Montfort was ultimately forced to retreat after 2 days of intense fighting. The French troops continued their advance, eventually reaching the Breton capital of Nantes. Following a brief siege, Montfort surrendered to the French forces, who promptly embraced response, Montfort's wife, Jane of Flanders, took charge of her husband's faction and resources, retreating to Finestère to await English reinforcements in the coming spring. The situation in Brittany presented an opportunity for Edward III of England to challenge Philip VI of France by opening a new front in the conflict. The strategic importance of Brittany's coastline for English trade and military operations necessitated a friendly ruler in the duchy. Despite facing logistical challenges in assembling a fleet, Edward managed to send reinforcements in August 1342, led by the Earl of Northampton and Robert of Artois. Their arrival from England helped relieve the siege at Brest and push back Charles of Blois, marking a significant turn in the conflict in Brittany. The ensuing battles and sieges across various regions of Brittany further intensified the conflict. A French cavalry charge near Morlaix resulted in heavy losses for the French forces, while King Edward's personal involvement in the siege of Vannes did not yield the desired results. Raids and skirmishes in different territories caused widespread destruction and sapped French morale. In December, a French royal army launched a counter-offensive against the English forces at Ploermel, underscoring the fierce and protracted nature of the struggle for control over Brittany. At this strategic location, the representatives of the Pope successfully negotiated a 3-year ceasefire, allowing the English monarch to return to his realm in January of 1343. Pope Clement VI took proactive steps to try to end the conflict by convening a peace summit at Avignon the following year. Despite the Pope's efforts, neither side was willing to agree to the terms proposed by the other, leading to the continuation of the war without any respite. The conflict in Brittany persisted as Charles of Blois perceived the civil war for the duchy as a personal vendetta between himself and Montfort, rather than a larger dispute between England and France. English supporters managed to seize control of Vannes and Redon towards the end of 1343, but Blois was able to capture the crucial town of Quimper in the subsequent year. This triumph, coupled with Montfort's passive approach and his desire to regain the favour of the French king, resulted in the collapse of the pro-English faction, causing many to seek refuge at Blois' court. The forces of Edward III were only able to maintain control over Vannes, Brest and Hennebon. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 signified a significant campaign by the English army into Gascony, with a substantial contingent led by the Earl of Derby successfully reclaiming Bergerac and defeating a French counter-offensive in October. This allowed Edward to regroup and organise his troops in England. Departing from Portchester in July 1346, he landed at the Norman port of La Hogue with a formidable military force, catching the local population by surprise. The untouched battleground in Normandy posed a threat to any potential levies the Valois king sought to impose, tarnishing Philip's reputation and goading him into a swift confrontation. The English forces embarked on a destructive campaign across the Cotentin Peninsula, deliberately devastating Normandy's fertile lands. Upon reaching Caen on July the 26th, Edward III accepted the surrender of its defenders, although his troops engaged in violent acts of pillaging, arson, and indiscriminate killings. Over a 3-day period, 3,000 residents perished, and the king began sending ships filled with looted riches back to England. As terrified refugees fled in his wake, the English monarch advanced towards Paris. Meanwhile, Philip VI was mobilising a substantial army near Saint-Denis upon hearing of the invasion, but it was not yet ready for battle and unable to intervene. Upon arriving in Poissy, Edward swiftly took action by deploying raiding parties to set fire to the surrounding towns, sending a clear message to Philip's people about their inability to protect them. This bold move was a strategic demonstration of English power and dominance, visible even from the outskirts of Paris. The English forces, under Edward's command, began their journey back north, but the French army quickly initiated pursuit, almost catching Edward off guard near the Somme River. Crossing the river successfully, the battle-tested English army established camp in the forest of Crécy on August 26, 1346. Despite skillfully evading the larger French army led by Philip thus far, the Valois monarch's vanguard was closing in, leading to the anticipation of a decisive confrontation. After conducting a brief reconnaissance, a strategic plan was devised. As the elite troops of Philip's army neared, Edward strategically positioned his forces on a raised ridge between Crécy and Agincourt, enticing the French to engage in battle. Edward's army, numbering approximately 14,000 warriors, consisted of various skilled fighters, including men-at-arms, dismounted knights, spearmen, hobelar light cavalry, and longbow archers armed with specialised arrows. The archers, a renowned force in England due to their longbow skills honed through regular training, were positioned strategically on the flanks, bolstered by defensive fortifications like pits, trenches, and stakes. Edward personally motivated his troops, instilling courage in those who may have been hesitant and emphasising the importance of discipline to maintain order. He prohibited unauthorised looting to keep the army focused and unified. With morale boosted and discipline enforced, Edward allowed his soldiers a brief respite to rest, eat, and prepare for the impending battle. Positioned atop a windmill overseeing his reserve division, the king assumed command of the field. On the other side, King Philip's French army, consisting of around 30,000 soldiers, began its slow advance in the late afternoon, including mounted knights, foot soldiers, and crossbowmen. With the sun setting and troops fatigued, Philip intended to heed his scout's advice by encamping for the night, preparing for the upcoming battle. At the break of dawn, the soldiers found themselves invigorated and prepared for the day ahead. Despite Philip's initial arrogance and lack of restraint, circumstances dictated that he lead an attack. The Valois forces, commanded by Philip, commenced their assault around 6 p.m. The Genoese and French crossbowmen took the lead up the ridge without their protective pavis shields, only to be met by a sudden, fierce thunderstorm that hindered their progress. The English longbowmen, with their superior range, swiftly unleashed a devastating barrage of arrows upon the crossbowmen, causing chaos and forcing the French to retreat. Witnessing what he perceived as cowardice among the retreating troops, the Count of Alençon ordered the knights to charge forward, inadvertently causing casualties among their own foot soldiers. This failed strategy stalled the progression of the knights and left them struggling at the base of the ridge. Despite some armoured warriors managing to breach the English line, they were quickly dispatched by Edward's infantry. The initial attack proved disastrous, but the day was far from over. Undeterred by the setback, the French mounted knights persistently launched assaults on the English front line, putting immense pressure on the right flank, where the Black Prince narrowly escaped death. Surrounded by enemy forces, the Black Prince sought aid from his father, only to be denied with the memorable words, "Let the boy earn his spurs, for I wish him to achieve all the glory." Eventually, the king sent 20 elite knights to support his son, who had regrouped and repelled the attack before the enemy could strike again. In a subsequent offensive, the blind king of Bohemia, John, instructed his knights to tether their horses to his own lead him into battle. This charge initially saw progress, breaking through the archers, but was ultimately decimated by the English foot soldiers. Despite launching a total of 15 unsuccessful charges, each more disorderly and desperate than the last, the French continued to struggle. As the battle raged on, Philip VI himself entered the fray. Despite sustaining an injury from an arrow and losing multiple horses, the Valois king was eventually persuaded by a vassal to retreat, albeit reluctantly. Fleeing with the remnants of his forces, the battle finally came to an end. The English army, under the leadership of Edward III, executed a shrewd manoeuvre by leaving a detachment at a nearby royal chateau before advancing towards Amiens. Little did they know that their strategic decision during the night had inflicted a devastating blow on the French forces. The losses suffered by Philip's army exceeded 10,000, including a substantial number of lords and knights, a stark contrast to the minimal English casualties of less than 100. Despite the fatigue of Edward's troops preventing them from immediately pursuing Philip, the king was resolute in capitalizing on this significant victory. Following the burial of the fallen French princes, the English forces embarked on a march northwards, plundering the countryside and unwalled towns until they reached the strategically vital town of Calais, positioned near Allied Flanders, easily resupplied from England, and equipped with a port. Calais was recognised as the perfect entry point for future incursions into France. The siege of Calais was initiated on September 4th, 1346, with prominent figures like Jean de Fosseur and Jean de Vienne leading the defence against the English onslaught. Edward established a sizable encampment, fortified key entrances, and cut off French relief efforts, all while ensuring a steady influx of reinforcements and supplies from England and Flanders. Furthermore, sporadic raids into the French heartland were carried out by the English forces, adding to the pressure on the French. Taking advantage of the diversion caused by the English activities in the north, the Earl of Derby, now also known as the Earl of Lancaster, expanded English dominion in Gascony and launched a coordinated offensive in September. Lancaster's strategic approach aimed at both expanding Gascon borders and disrupting the French hold on Paris. Leading a devastating campaign northwards, his forces pillaged the prosperous city of Poitiers and its environs before retracing their steps back to Gascony. Moreover, the English celebrated a significant victory when a Scottish invasion, prompted by France, was decisively crushed at Neville's Cross near Durham in October, resulting in the capture of the Scottish king and numerous nobles. These dual successes dealt a severe blow to the French administration, which grappled with the efficient allocation of resources. Despite minor disruptions in the English supply chains, major military actions were postponed. The protracted siege of Calais continued through the harsh winter, marked by a stalemate where neither side could gain a decisive advantage. While the French managed to resupply the besieged garrison by sea, Edward's repeated assaults on the city walls, bolstered by artillery and stone throwers, proved ineffective. The besieging forces suffered from dwindling numbers due to desertions and illnesses. It was only in June that Philip mustered adequate forces to advance, following Edward's successful severing of Calais supply routes, subjecting the city to deprivation and increasing pressure on its defenders. The grand plan to launch an attack through Flanders and encircle the English from the north faced significant challenges as the vanguards encountered obstacles along the way. As the situation in Calais became critical, Philip made the tough decision to move his forces towards the besieged town, only to find that the English had fortified their positions too strongly, making it impossible to provide relief. Eventually, Philip had to surrender control of Calais, which fell into English hands until 1558. Despite subsequent small chevauchés, both sides were fatigued from the ongoing conflict following Edward III's victory at Crécy and the capture of Calais. The English, once perceived as timid, were now praised as esteemed warriors in Europe. Edward III's financial struggles persisted, prompting his retreat from the continent after signing the Truce of Calais in September 1347. Upon his return to England, he celebrated the success of the Crécy campaign with a grand tournament featuring prominent prisoners of war. Meanwhile, in France, Philip VI faced criticism from his Estates General for his defeat and was barred from raising taxes. Despite the humiliation, the French aristocracy united to fund a major invasion of England. Orders were swiftly issued, and preparations began for a renewed conflict, with a new fleet under construction and towns being assessed for the upcoming levy. However, a looming catastrophe thwarted the impending war: the Black Death. The deadly Yersinia pestis, which had devastated the Byzantine Empire, emerged in Central Asia in the early 14th century. Khan Janibeg's army was decimated by the plague during the siege of Kaffa in 1346, leading to infected corpses being catapulted into the city. The disease spread westward through fleeing Italian citizens, reaching Italy by the end of 1347, and then France before advancing to England by mid-1348. This devastating pandemic, marking the most significant demographic crisis in European history, claimed countless lives, including those of the elite. The feudal economy, a hierarchical system that encompassed nobles and peasant labourers, experienced a collapse in the revenue generated through the taxes as a result of the devastating impact of the plague. Estimates suggest that between a third and half of Europe's population perished during the initial onslaught of the Black Death, leading to widespread fears of an imminent societal breakdown. By 1350, the aftermath of the plague had caused a significant depletion in both manpower and financial resources, bringing military operations to a halt as nations struggled to recover. Amidst this chaos, the succession of Jean II to the French throne following the death of King Philip VI further complicated the already tumultuous political landscape in Europe. The Breton Civil War saw the English gaining the upper hand by capturing Charles the Blois, sparking fierce conflicts between the Blois and Montfort factions. The iconic Combat of the 30, a famous showdown between English and French troops, resulted in the surrender of the English forces, showcasing the intensity of the clashes during this period. In 1352, a French military contingent clashed with English troops in Brittany near the village of Moron. Despite being outnumbered, the English soldiers valiantly stood their ground, refusing to surrender and engaging in direct combat. This defiance displayed by the English troops highlighted the persistence and determination of soldiers during this tumultuous period in European history. Employing a strategic and calculated manoeuvre, the English forces orchestrated a brilliant cavalry charge that encircled Bentley's men at arms while simultaneously launching an assault on the other two flanks. This complex manoeuvre proved highly effective in shattering the archers' defences, causing them to scatter and leaving Bentley's central forces vulnerable to attacks from both sides. Despite the brave resistance put up by the men at arms, the archers on the left managed to repel their assailants, creating a gap for their comrades to exploit. The English centre swiftly retaliated against the French right flank, forcing the enemy to retreat and succumb to the deadly accuracy of the English longbowmen. The battle resulted in significant casualties on both sides, with the French suffering particularly heavy negotiations with King Edward, agreeing to a substantial ransom payment and recognising Brittany as a neutral territory in exchange for being acknowledged as the Duke of Brittany. While the terms of the agreement were not fully upheld, they effectively brought Brittany under English influence for the following years, despite simmering tensions between the claimants. The situation escalated when the English king proposed relinquishing his claim to the French throne in return for territorial gains and suzerainty over Flanders. Although initially accepting the terms, Jean too later reneged on the agreement, reigniting hostilities between the two powers. The resumption of hostilities was triggered by England's collaboration with King Charles II of Navarre, who had a strong claim to the French throne. With the backing of England, Charles II orchestrated the assassination of the Franco-Castilian Constable of France, further fueling animosity between the factions. Efforts to mediate a peace agreement between the French and Navarrese rulers proved futile, as Charles remained dissatisfied, prompting Edward III to resume military campaigns as the impact of the plague waned. Additionally, prominent Gascon nobles made a significant journey north for a momentous event at the beginning of the same year. Thomas, the son of the monarch, arrived at court with grim news and an urgent request for assistance. The situation in Gascony had been dire since 1352, with the French Count of Armagnac, Jean I, besieging Edward's ancestral territories. By May 1354, Bordeaux, the primary city in the region, was on the brink of falling to Armagnac forces. The Gascons, desperate for help, implored King Edward to send aid, leading him to order his son, Edward of Woodstock, to gather an army and sail to the troubled region in southern France. In September 1355, the Black Prince and his troops reached Bordeaux and were joined by additional reinforcements from Gascony. While the French ruler mobilised his forces, their efforts were too slow to save the southern territories from the advancing English army. The Black Prince and his soldiers embarked on a ruthless chevauchée, devastating Armagnac lands and disrupting the French military campaign. Despite being outnumbered, the Count of Armagnac chose to remain stationed in Toulouse as the English troops wreaked havoc on towns like Carcassonne and Narbonne. After inflicting significant damage, the Black Prince's army began the journey back to Gascony, facing minimal resistance along the way. The incursion left over 500 settlements in ruins, weakening the French monarch's tax revenue and tarnishing his military reputation. Spending the winter in Gascony, the Black Prince focused on administrative tasks and minor military actions. The success of the initial chevauchée, combined with reinforcements from England and new allies in Gascony, paved the way for a second expedition into French territory. In August 1356, the prince led another swift campaign, swiftly advancing through various towns mere days after departing. The Black Prince's army, led by Edward, made their way through the French countryside, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake as they advanced towards Bellec on August 16th. It was a strategic move, as the town belonged to a noble with ties to the English royal family, and thus the soldiers were ordered to refrain from causing any harm. However, as they continued their march, they encountered growing resistance from the French locals, who had started to fight back against the invading forces. Despite the challenges, Edward managed to reach Issoudun on the 24th, but his attempt to capture the fortified city was unsuccessful, leading him to opt for destroying its outskirts before moving on. Just a few days later, near Vierzon, a group of 200 raiders engaged in a skirmish with a French reconnaissance party, capturing a few prisoners who revealed that Jean II was amassing a large army to confront the Black Prince's forces. To understand the Prince's movements, one must delve into the events of early 1356 in northern France. A fragile truce between Jean and Charles the Bad had been shattered by rumours of the latter seeking refuge with Edward III, compelling Jean to take action. Charles's close ties to the French Dauphin Charles only fueled suspicion, leading to a brutal crackdown in Rouen in April 1356. This incident prompted an alliance between Charles's brother Philip and the English monarch. Allowing Jean to seize Navarrese territories in the region, Jean's campaign to capture these territories, starting with the siege of Breteuil on July 12th, was complicated by new threats from the north and south, including the Black Prince's chevauchée and an invasion by Henry, Duke of Lancaster, in Normandy. Recognising the need to address the growing crisis, Jean swiftly ended the siege of Breteuil, paid off the defenders, and marched to Chartres to rally his nobles. As these events unfolded, the Black Prince lingered in Vierzon, contemplating his next move as news of Jean's actions reached him. Realising the vulnerability of his position and the looming threat of pursuit, Edward knew he had to swiftly retreat to friendly territory to avoid being caught in a precarious situation. As Edward hastily led his troops in a strategic withdrawal along the Cher River, he faced numerous obstacles that slowed his progress. For instance, the prolonged siege at Romorantin and the failed attempt by the Duke of Lancaster to join forces caused significant delays, allowing Jean's army to draw closer. With Jean's forces hot on their trail, Edward's army reached a critical juncture at La Haye, realising they were within a day's march of their pursuers. Despite his temptation to pursue the retreating English, Jean opted for a more strategic approach, leveraging his knowledge of the terrain to position his troops advantageously east of the Vienne River. This decision set the stage for a pivotal confrontation at Chauvigny, where a cavalry-heavy segment of Jean's army crossed the river to prepare for battle. The composition of Edward's army revealed a diverse array of troops, including Gascon infantry, English men-at-arms, and skilled longbowmen. These forces were organised into distinct divisions, with reserves strategically held in the rearguard. On the opposing side, the French army, under the command of King Jean II, boasted a formidable array of infantry and mounted knights. To prevent a repeat of the Crécy disaster, most of the French knights were instructed to dismount, with only a select few remaining mounted. The French army's strategic positioning, with cavalry and missile units flanking the infantry in the centre, showcased Jean's tactical acumen. Amidst the tension and anticipation of the impending battle near Poitiers, a French cardinal's attempt to broker peace with the Black Prince underscored the gravity of the situation. However, Edward's terse response highlighted the urgency of the moment, as both sides braced for a clash that would ultimately shape the course of the conflict. The scene was set for a dramatic confrontation, with both armies poised for a decisive engagement in late September 1356. The potential loss of lives weighed heavily on all involved as the impending battle loomed closer. Despite harbouring deep-seated animosity, the prince had reservations about engaging in a decisive battle and was willing to consider significant compromises. Unfortunately, Jean II's unwavering demand for unconditional surrender left no other option but to prepare for conflict. While keeping a watchful eye on the English movements from a distance, the French commanders, Ordrem and Clermont, noticed a suspicious increase in activity, mistakenly interpreting it as a sign of retreat, potentially a deliberate deception. Driven by the determination not to let the enemy slip away, Ordrem impulsively led his cavalry towards Warwick's left flank, while Clermont, hesitantly mirrored the action by advancing towards Salisbury's right side. Initially, Aldreham's heavily armoured knights and horses stood strong against the English arrows and charged into the infantry, causing chaos in the front lines. However, the situation took a turn for the worse when English longbowmen advanced along the river bank to support their left wing, showering Aldreham's exposed flank with a relentless volley of arrows, leading to a devastating outcome for the French, with many knights succumbing to arrows or trampling by their own mounts, and the marshal himself being captured. On the opposite end of the battlefield, Clermont's cavalry made a courageous charge up the ridge towards Salisbury's troops, but found themselves trapped in a narrow gap in the hedge protecting the English line. In this confined space, the clustered cavalry suffered substantial casualties before breaking through, only to face Salisbury's dismounted knights in a fierce confrontation that pushed the French forces back. The French infantry vanguard under the Dauphin followed closely behind in a disciplined formation across the entire front. However, they too had to navigate through the openings in the hedge, making themselves easy targets for the relentless barrage of arrows. Those who breached the defences found themselves in brutal close combat with the Anglo-Gascon men-at-arms, resulting in significant losses with no significant gains. Following the defeat of the Dauphin's forces, King Jean II decided to remove his son from the battlefield as a precautionary measure, but this decision backfired catastrophically. The Dauphin's withdrawal led the Duke of Orléans, who commanded the second line of infantry, to also retreat with his troops, leading the final and largest division. Jean II, armed with a battle axe, advanced towards the English on the ridge, with crossbowmen at the front and infantry behind. With the Black Prince's archers running low on ammunition, the French king's forces closed in on the English relatively unscathed, their elite knights and fresh 3rd Division overpowering the resilient and steadfast army of the Prince. In the midst of the chaos, as arrows dwindled, the archers discarded their bows and joined the melee armed with swords, knives, and axes. At a critical point in the battle, the Captal de Buc rallied 200 reserve troops to join the intense fray, adding to the escalating intensity of the conflict. During the Battle of Poitiers, the English forces, led by the strategic Edward, the Black Prince, devised a brilliant plan to outwit and overpower the French army commanded by King Jean. Sir James Audley's cavalry played a pivotal role in executing a devastating attack on the flanks of the French troops, which caused chaos and led to the eventual capture of King Jean by the English soldiers. This victory not only showcased the military prowess of the English forces, but also highlighted their ability to achieve success with minimal casualties, solidifying their dominance on the battlefield. The consequences of the Battle of Poitiers reverberated throughout France, plunging the nation into a tumultuous period marked by internal conflicts and widespread discontent among both the nobility and the common people. With King Jean taken captive, the country was thrown into disarray, creating a power vacuum that was quickly filled by marauding bands of rogue soldiers and criminals who pillaged and terrorized the population for years to come, exacerbating the already fragile state of the kingdom. The exorbitant ransom demands imposed by the English for the release of noble captives captured at Poitiers placed a heavy financial burden on France, leading to an increase in taxes that only added to the existing social and economic challenges faced by the country. This financial strain, coupled with ongoing feudal governance issues, fueled the flames of discontent among the peasantry, culminating in the violent peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie, where commoners targeted and killed nobles in a bid for social justice. The revolt was eventually quelled by Charles of Navarre, but it underscored the deep-rooted societal tensions that plagued France in the aftermath of the Battle of Poitiers. In response to continued English threats, the Dauphin of France was compelled to sign the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, conceding territories to the Plantagenets and marking the end of the Edwardian era. This treaty not only altered the geopolitical landscape of France, but also further destabilised the nation, fueling the ongoing turmoil and challenges that defined this turbulent period in French history. After paying 2/3 of the £600,000 ransom and renouncing his claim to the French throne in favour of the English king, Jean was allowed to return to France. However, when one of his sons managed to escape captivity, the French ruler willingly went back into imprisonment in exchange for his younger son. Sadly, Jean II passed away while in captivity in 1364, leading to Charles succeeding him as King of France. Before Charles's coronation, the Duchy of Burgundy returned to the Crown land following the death of the last Capetian Duke in 1361. Philip the Bold, John II's son, was granted the title despite objections from the Navarrese king, Charles. In response, Charles assembled an army under the leadership of Captal de Buch to threaten Paris and assert his claim. The French, under Bertrand du Guesclin's command, took preemptive action against the Navarrese troops in Normandy, resulting in the crucial Battle of Cocherel in 1364. With around 2,000 knights, Captal de Buch's army faced du Guesclin's 1,200 soldiers near Cocherel. After a 2-day standoff, the French troops began to retreat, leading to Buch to block the bridge and confront the royal army. Despite de Buch having the initial advantage in numbers, the arrival of a Breton reserve during the battle shifted the momentum in favour of the French forces, ultimately leading to their victory. The Navarrese employed a clever military tactic by dispersing their forces, which forced their enemies to retreat and left their leader vulnerable on the battlefield, resulting in his capture. This victory, just days before Charles V's coronation, significantly weakened Charles the Bad's power and prevented him from posing a serious threat to the French monarchy after his defeat at Cocherel. The loss of most of his territories in Normandy led to a peace agreement in 1365, following an unsuccessful attempt to retaliate. In Brittany, the conflict involving Charles of Blois was drawing to a close. Released from English imprisonment in 1356, he found a large part of his realm controlled by the Duke of Lancaster after the Battle of Poitiers. English forces failed in an attempt to capture Rennes, facing strong resistance from Bertrand du Guesclin. Civil unrest erupted again in 1362 when Charles laid siege to Becherel, leading to further hostilities as John of Montfort besieged Auray in 1364. John of Montfort's army, comprising around 2,000 soldiers with support from English and Navarrese troops, faced off against Charles of Blois' force of 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers, backed by Bertrand du Guesclin and Breton units. Despite attempts at negotiation before the battle, Montfort showed a willingness to compromise, contrasting with the English and du Guesclin's determination to fight. As the battle began, a significant number of Breton fighters deserted du Guesclin's faction, weakening the French forces. The coalition of English and Breton troops on the left flank clashed with the French on the right, capturing their leader and causing the collapse of the French contingent. Charles eventually surrendered, bringing an end to the conflict in Brittany. Montfort and Chandos strategically capitalised on the opportunity presented to them to isolate the pretender Charles of Blois, ultimately leading to his fatal death decisive defeat of the Blois faction. The aftermath of the battle saw around 1,500 soldiers, including the renowned de Guesclin, being captured and subsequently ransomed for a significant sum. The surrender of all supporters of Blois to Montfort swiftly followed, marking the beginning of the end of the Breton Civil War. The Treaty of Guerande in 1365 officially brought an end to the conflict, with Montfort paying homage to Charles III for the duchy, and Jeanne de Penthièvre being allowed to retain her lands for herself and her descendants. As a consequence of their victory, the Montforts gradually distanced themselves from their former English allies, resulting in a noticeable decline in English influence in the region post-1365. The Castilian Civil War, spanning from 1350 to 1373, reached its climax at the Battle of Najera in 1367. Against the backdrop of the civil unrest, Charles found himself contending with marauding routiers, while the Treaty of Bretigny was still in effect. In a bid to address this issue and establish an alliance with the Kingdom of Castile, Charles intervened in the Iberian Peninsula, a move that mirrored the actions of the Black Prince. To understand the complexities of the situation, it is necessary to look back to 1350, when Alfonso XI, the King of Castile, passed away, leaving his young son Pedro to take the throne. Initially influenced by his mother Maria of Portugal and the Portuguese noble Albuquerque, Pedro faced rebellions from the illegitimate children of Alfonso, particularly Henry, Count of Trastamara. These rebellions, spearheaded by Albuquerque and Henry, nearly succeeded in capturing Pedro, but internal strife among the nobles prevented their plans from coming to fruition. The tensions escalated in 1356 with the outbreak of the War of the Two Peters between Castile and Aragon, a conflict orchestrated by the Aragonese to exploit Castile's weaknesses and annex the disputed region of Murcia. In response, Pedro launched aggressive raids into Aragon, ultimately seizing the town of Ibiza in 1357. Following the initial aggressive manoeuvres at the start of the conflict in Tarazona, the pace of the war noticeably decelerated. Pedro resorted to intermittent, low-intensity operations and laid siege to border areas, periodically breaking short-lived truces. Captured Aragonese towns faced population displacement and subsequent resettlement by Castilian colonists. The retaliatory actions from Aragon primarily came from Pedro's exiled brother, Henry de Trastamara. The Battle of Araviana in 1359 inflicted a setback on the Castilians, despite their control over sizable portions of Aragonese territory. A formidable Castilian naval presence, bolstered by Portuguese and Granadan forces, advanced towards Barcelona, signalling a looming threat. In the aftermath of a coup in Granada in 1361 that ousted Pedro's ally, Muhammad V, the Castilian king was compelled to negotiate a truce, conceding his gains in Aragon. Subsequently, Pedro shifted his attention to Granada, aiding in the restoration of his ally to the throne. However, in 1362, Pedro violated the truce by seizing Calatayud unexpectedly, reoccupying significant swathes of western Aragon and menacing Valencia by 1364. Concurrently, tensions escalated between the Spanish and French courts, exacerbated by Pedro's tumultuous marriage to Blanche of Bourbon, a relative of John II. The strained marital alliance led to desertion and imprisonment. In 1362, Pedro and the Black Prince forged a formal alliance, solidifying their partnership. By 1364, a joint strategy was devised by the French and Aragonese to expel routiers from southern France and sow chaos in the pro-English Castilian domain, Henry de Trastamara took the lead in an incursion into Iberia, supported by Bertrand de Guesclin, under the pretense of crusading against the Islamic remnants in Granada. The expedition in the autumn of 1365 penetrated into the kingdom of Aragon, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. By February 1366, the vanguard successfully recaptured Castilian-held towns, culminating in the declaration of Henry as king in Calahorra by March. Pedro's faction crumbled, forcing his retreat initially to Seville and eventually to Galicia. Henry's triumphant entry into Burgos marked a turning point as he traversed the kingdom to Seville, where the royal treasury was seized, solidifying his grip on power. The sudden attack on the ally of the Black Prince took the Gascon court by surprise, and they were unable to gather a relief force promptly. In a meeting in August, Pedro, Prince Edward, and Charles of Navarre came to an agreement. Gascony would raise an army to help Pedro regain the Castilian throne, and Navarre would allow unrestricted passage. Pedro would finance the entire campaign and cede the Basque territories to his allies in exchange. By January 1367, a diverse army of around 10,000 to 8,000 soldiers, many of whom had participated in de Guesclin's previous campaign, crossed into Castile. Henry was in a difficult position, having released most of his troops and emptied his treasury. Many towns and nobles sided with Pedro upon his arrival. The invaders decided to move north, avoiding the main route to Burgos, but the arid landscape made it challenging to find provisions, leading to a standoff at Vitoria. By the end of March, the Black Prince moved towards Logroño, with Henry following them to Najera. Against the advice of his advisors, Henry decided to advance toward his enemies on April 1st, leaving his fortified position behind the river Najarilla. Pedro and the Black Prince moved to Navarrete the next day with a force of approximately 8,000 archers and cavalry. The vanguard was led by John of Gaunt and Sir Chandos, while the flanks were commanded by the Counts of Foix and Armagnac, and the Black Prince led the main contingent, which consisted of various troops and loyalists. The Castilian army had only about 4,500 soldiers, including some French and Breton cavalry under de Guesclin and other French mercenaries. In contrast to his opponent, the Trastamaran army was strategically organised with the Frenchmen at arms and elite Castilian knights forming the front line, complemented by a mix of missile troops and fresh recruits. Henry led the main force, consisting of around 1,500 Iberian soldiers, while light cavalry positioned on the left flank and troops from Aragon on the right flank added strength to their formation. As the Black Prince surprised them with a northern route attack, de Guesclin swiftly reorganised his troops, though some Castilian foot soldiers and light cavalry succumbed to panic and fled. The ensuing clash saw the Breton commander ordering a charge, leading to a fierce close combat where the English eventually overpowered the Trastamara forces. Sections of the Trastamaran army found themselves isolated and defeated, with the main Castilian force being routed and decimated as they tried to retreat. Henry suffered a complete defeat, losing nearly half of his army, while the English sustained minimal losses. Most of the French Castilian leaders were captured for potential ransom, except for Henry, who managed to escape. Pedro reclaimed the kingdom of Castile after the victory, but his control over Basque territories and inability to repay the Duke of Gascony placed a heavy financial burden on Gascony due to anticipated funds from the invasion. Edward had to return home due to these financial constraints, while the French court quickly provided Henry with new military supplies, enabling him to regroup and cross the Pyrenees with a smaller force later in 1367. Upon his triumphant return to the kingdom after a long and arduous journey, Henry was met with a diverse array of nobles, some of whom had been loyal to Pedro and others who had suffered under his tyrannical rule. This mix of allies and adversaries set the stage for a complex political landscape as Henry swiftly reasserted his control over Castile and León. The siege on the capital city of Toledo, which commenced in late April of 1368, marked the beginning of Henry's campaign to reclaim his rightful place on the throne. Meanwhile, Pedro, realizing the gravity of the situation, made a strategic retreat with his forces to the Guadalquivir Valley, seeking refuge among his allies in Granada and Portugal. Despite his efforts to rally support and besiege Cordoba, Pedro faced a series of setbacks that forced him to alter his course, eventually leading him northwards to regroup with his loyalists in León before heading east. The fateful encounter on the 14th of March, 1369, near the castle of Montiel, proved to be the turning point in the conflict between Henry and Pedro. With the forces of Henry and the seasoned commander de Guesclin converging on Pedro's dwindling army, the battle culminated in a resounding victory for Henry's forces. In a last-ditch effort to secure his position, Pedro sought refuge within the walls of the castle of Montiel, accompanied by only a handful of steadfast followers. Despite his attempts to negotiate with de Guesclin, the Breton commander remained loyal to Henry, ultimately leading to Pedro's capture and subsequent demise. This pivotal moment solidified Henry's claim to the throne of Castile, aligning his reign with the interests of the French crown and securing vital maritime support for the French fleet in the Atlantic. As Edward made his way back to Bordeaux in the late 1360s, his physical health faltered due to the lingering effects of an illness contracted during his time in Spain. The governance of Aquitaine under his direct rule had also become a point of contention, particularly among the English subjects who had long endured the burdensome taxes imposed for military campaigns and the maintenance of Bordeaux. The announcement of yet another half-tax in 1368 proved to be the final straw for the disgruntled feudal lords, sparking a widespread revolt that quickly gained momentum. Sensing an opportunity to expand his influence, Charles of France dispatched his son, Charles VI, along with a formidable army to support the rebels in Bordeaux. Edward, facing overwhelming opposition, suffered a decisive defeat and was forced to retreat to England, leaving the Gascons to pledge their allegiance to Charles. This shift in power led to the direct royal administration of Aquitaine as part of the French crown domain, marking a significant loss for Edward and a strategic gain for Charles V, the ruler of Aquitaine, cunningly utilised a legal loophole found in the Treaty of Bretigny to justify his reclaiming of English territories in France in 1369. This move marked a turning point in the conflict as it reignited the war despite Edward III's efforts towards peace. The French monarch, known for his calculated strategies, sought vengeance against the English, pushing for the reconquest of territories lost in previous battles. With innovative tactics in play, the French forces, under Charles V's guidance, swiftly captured key regions like Ponthieu and Rouergue, opting to avoid direct confrontations to circumvent the risk of past defeats. In the midst of the escalating hostilities, notable figures like John of Gaunt and Sir Robert Knowles played significant roles in the conflict. John of Gaunt, led a daring raid in Normandy, showcasing the English forces' agility in striking behind enemy lines before retreating strategically. Meanwhile, Sir Robert Knowles orchestrated a formidable raid with 4,000 troops from Calais, causing havoc as they advanced towards Paris. The chaos created by these raids prompted Charles to appoint Bertrand de Guesclin as the new Constable of France, recognising the need for a skilled military leader to counter the English threat. The English forces, divided into two columns, faced challenges in coordination, leading to confusion within their ranks as they navigated through unfamiliar territories. As the tensions mounted between the opposing forces, Bertrand de Guesclin wasted no time in mobilising the French troops for a decisive confrontation. The ambush at Pontvalin in December saw the French forces numbering 4,000 catching the English off guard, resulting in a resounding victory for the French. Despite internal disagreements among the English officers regarding strategy, the swift and coordinated actions of the French forces proved instrumental in halting the English advance and securing a crucial win in the ongoing conflict. After the intense battle, only a mere 300 French foot soldiers stood victorious, while the majority of Grandison's force, which was estimated to be between 600 and 1,200 men, either perished or were taken prisoner. Following this, another English contingent, led by Sir Fitzwalter, headed south towards the fortified Abbey of Vasse. Sancerre's troops then swiftly attacked Fitzwalter, who was positioned under the abbey's walls, and was soon bolstered by Guesclin's advancing forces. After a full day of relentless combat, the French emerged triumphant, capturing the abbey and eliminating its defenders. Knowles and the 4th English Division managed to safely enter Brittany with their spoils, but they encountered French cavalry as they journeyed back to England in the spring, enduring constant harassment. Survivors from the battles of Pontvalin and Vasse were pursued into English-controlled Aquitaine, solidifying the French morale with a significant victory over the English in direct combat. In the southern territories, under the command of Charles' sibling, the Duke of Anjou, French forces extended their successes by seizing Agenais, Limousin and Buzac from the English, causing several local nobles to switch allegiance to the Valois. The ailing Black Prince was enraged by the betrayal of his nobles, especially when the Bishop of Limoges handed over the town to the French. 3 weeks after the departure of the French troops, the Black Prince laid siege to Limoges, a 5-day operation under the leadership of his brother John of Gaunt. Tunnels were meticulously constructed beneath the city walls to breach the defences, resulting in a brutal storming of the city and widespread looting that left extensive damage in its wake. With his strength waning and his spirits low due to the loss of his eldest son, the Black Prince departed for England in 1371, leaving John of Gaunt in charge of Aquitaine. Simultaneously, Du Guesclin and other French commanders successfully captured numerous castles that were previously held by English forces from earlier campaigns, relentlessly advancing against English strongholds in the southwest as John of Gaunt reclaimed certain towns in Perigord. England's foothold in France was significantly weakened by financial struggles and the absence of key leaders. By the end of 1371, Limoges surrendered to Charles, although it remained under the influence of English mercenaries. Bertrand de Guesclin spearheaded the French campaign in 1372, further solidifying their advances against the English forces. The Duke of Berry's decision to retake Poitou set off a chain of events that led to a significant naval confrontation between English and Castilian forces. In response, Edward III dispatched the Earl of Pembroke with a small but determined force to Aquitaine. Pembroke's fleet, equipped with innovative archery towers on 3 of its then fought bravely, with his archers proving particularly effective in repelling the Castilian assault. The battle raged on until nightfall, when the ships disengaged, marking a temporary halt in the conflict. As the English ships anchored at sea, awaiting the dawn, Poitevin knights and their followers covertly joined forces with them. The Castilians, not willing to let their enemy regroup, launched a daring nighttime attack, setting the English ships on fire with flaming arrows and oil. The battle concluded with a resounding victory for the Castilian allies of France, resulting in heavy losses for the English, the destruction of most of their ships, and the capture of Pembroke. This defeat at La Rochelle dealt a severe blow to English naval dominance and forced Edward III to reconsider his military strategy in the region. In the aftermath of the disastrous defeat at La Rochelle, English defences in Aquitaine began to crumble rapidly. Poitiers and several key castles fell to French forces, with La Rochelle eventually surrendering in September. The regions of Thouars, Saintonge, and Angoumois came under French control, further weakening English presence in the area. Subsequent battles, such as the one at Chise in 1373, spelled the end of English resistance in Poitou. Meanwhile, in Brittany, English forces faced minimal opposition near Brest, but the duchy eventually succumbed to French advances after a series of defeats and surrenders. The events following the Battle of La Rochelle marked a significant turning point in the 100 Years' War, with the English losing ground in key territories in France. In the historical context of 1373, a significant shift in power occurred as the French authorities restricted Brest, Laval, and Auray to English control. This move prompted John of Gaunt to orchestrate the Great Chevauchée in that same year, a military campaign that saw approximately 10,000 men wreak havoc in the regions of Picardy, Champagne, and Burgundy before reaching Bordeaux by December. The French, instead of engaging the English army in direct combat, strategically focused on disrupting their supply lines to minimise the impact of the chevauchée. By the end of 1373, the majority of Aquitaine had been reclaimed by the French, showcasing their successful tactics in countering the English offensive. Following the events of 1373, peace negotiations were initiated in 1374 and culminated in a conference in Bruges in 1375, where Philip of Burgundy and John of Gaunt played pivotal roles. Despite these diplomatic efforts, conflicts persisted in Aquitaine, resulting in the French reclaiming several English strongholds in the region. In Brittany, an English military force managed to encircle opposition forces, but was ultimately obliged to release them due to a 2-year truce declared in Bruges. This truce effectively marked the end of 6 years of intense conflict, restoring English territories in France to their pre-war condition. As the truce extended into 1376 and 1377, occasional skirmishes in Gascony posed threats to the established peace. The English Parliament of 1376 attempted to address grievances stemming from the wartime period, but reforms faced obstacles, particularly from John of Gaunt, leading to his waning popularity. The passing of the Black Prince and Edward III in 1376 and 1377, respectively, signified the end of the Caroline phase, marking a transition in English leadership and setting the stage for future developments in the ongoing conflicts between England and France. Following a 50-year rule that was regarded as a prosperous era for England, Richard II ascended the throne after his revered father, King Edward III. Given Richard II's young age at the time of his coronation, a regency council was established to govern in his place until after Richard II took the throne, the Kingdom of England found itself under assault by French pirates under the command of Jean de Vienne, who launched devastating attacks on channel ports from Rye to Plymouth. Concurrently, the Duke of Burgundy's siege on Calais faced failure, while the Duke of Anjou made significant advances in Gascony. In response, the English decided to strengthen their presence in Brittany and seized the strategic port of Cherbourg to initiate raids at sea. The year 1378 marked a pivotal moment in Catholic Europe with the onset of the Western Schism, which led to a division within the Church. This schism had reverberations in the political landscape, as Charles III seized the Breton Duchy, sparking a rebellion among Breton nobles who sided with France. John IV of Montfort emerged as a key figure in reclaiming authority with the support of the English, forging a crucial alliance between the Bretons and the English. This alliance enabled English forces to move through Breton lands to provide assistance to Gascony. Thomas of Woodstock, leading an army from Calais, journeyed to reinforce Gascon territories, eventually reaching Troyes in Champagne, where they confronted French forces under the command of the Duke of Burgundy. Upon assessing the military situation, the Duke of Burgundy chose to avoid direct confrontation and retreated within the defences of Troyes. Woodstock, undeterred, continued his westward advance, with the Duke of Burgundy closely following. However, the progress of the English military campaign was soon interrupted by news from Paris, where Charles V encountered unexpected setbacks that would have far-reaching implications. Following the demise of the esteemed Breton commander de Gisclin, a power struggle ensued in France, creating opportunities for the English to advance in Brittany without facing any significant obstacles. The English forces besieged the French-controlled city of Nantes for several months, from November to January 1381, but were ultimately unsuccessful in capturing it. Meanwhile, John IV of Montfort, who had initially intended to support the English cause, struck a deal with the Parisian throne after the passing of Charles. In exchange for cutting ties with the English, John IV was reinstated as the Duke of Brittany, with his former privileges restored, leading to a cessation of hostilities. The death of the politically savvy Charles the Wise in September 1380 marked a turning point in the political landscape of France. His 11-year-old successor, Charles VI, was placed under the guardianship of his four uncles, collectively known as the Princes of Blood. Notably, Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, wielded significant influence among the uncles, enabling them to consolidate power, deplete Charles V's treasury, and set the stage for future power struggles within the French court. In England, discontent simmered among the populace due to heavy taxes and war weariness, culminating in the eruption of the Wat Tyler Rebellion in 1381. Peasant uprisings instigated by Wat Tyler and John Bull erupted in Essex and Kent in response to the enforcement of a third poll tax. The rebels, targeting allies of the King's ministers and John of Gaunt, launched an assault on London in June, prompting the King to seek negotiations at Greenwich. However, the rebels demanded the King's presence for talks, leading to chaos in London as they demolished prisons and properties associated with their perceived adversaries, including John of Gaunt's residence. Ultimately, the King and his supporters sought refuge in the Tower of London as the rebellion unfolded. Riding his horse to Mile End, Richard met with the leader of the rebellion to discuss a set of demands put forth by the peasants. These demands included the immediate abolishment of serfdom, the removal of oppressive laws and taxes, the punishment of corrupt officials, and the end of privileges held by the nobility. Despite his reservations, executing several officials and prompting the need for a plan to capture the ringleaders of the rebellion. The following day, a tense meeting between the king and the rebels quickly escalated into a heated altercation, culminating in a chaotic clash. Surrounded by armed men from London, the rebels eventually relented and agreed to disband, leading to the execution of the main instigators. The repercussions of the rebellion reverberated throughout England, effectively dampening the spirit of potential uprisings as the authorities swiftly used force to suppress any further unrest. The Parliament, wary of provoking more rebellion, became reluctant to impose new taxes, which, in turn, limited the king's ability to fund military campaigns. In the year 1379, the region of Flanders faced its own wave of turmoil, as a rebellion erupted in the city of Ghent and quickly spread to other towns and cities. Count Louis de Male found himself struggling to maintain order in the face of economic decline and widespread dissatisfaction among the lower classes, further destabilising the region. Gaining control over the county was a complex process that involved forming alliances with local supporters, with Ghent emerging as a notable exception due to its resilience. The city faced a severe blockade in 1381, causing shortages of provisions and essential supplies. This led to a division in the region, with nobles and knights aligning themselves with the count, while nearby towns stood in solidarity with Ghent, resulting in a split in the Low Countries. As Ghent teetered on the verge of surrender in January 1382, Philip van Artevelde, a member of the Weavers' Guild, seized power and rejected the proposed peace terms, leading to a violent confrontation that claimed the lives of individuals who supported the peace agreement from the Craftsman Guild and grain merchants. On May 3rd, 1382, Van Artevelde orchestrated a daring attack on Bruges during a local festival, where his forces defeated an inebriated Bruges army and supporters of Count Louis. Subsequently, with the assistance of the local Weavers' Guild, Van Artevelde successfully took control of the city. Following the defeat of Count Louis, who narrowly escaped his pursuers, Ypres and several other Flemish-speaking towns rebelled once again, breaking the suffocating blockade imposed on Ghent. In October, a French army, initially intended for Gascony, was redirected north to quell the Flemish rebels, a move that pleased the Duke of Burgundy, who had married Margaret of Flanders, the daughter and sole heir of Louis of Flanders. The French army, commanded by the new constable Oliver de Clisson and accompanied by a young Charles VI, consisted of approximately 10,000 soldiers, including 2,000 Burgundians. This force comprised 6,500 men-at-arms, 2,000 pikemen, and 1,200 archers and crossbowmen, who were joined by Flemish nobles and other troops from the Low Countries under Louis of Flanders. They were met by around 30,000 to 40,000 Flemish fighters, primarily townspeople with limited combat experience, along with a small contingent of English archers and German mercenaries. The clash occurred at Oudenarde, where the Flemish had been besieging Philip's stronghold for 4 months. Marching from Arras on November 12th, the French forces, led by Louis's army, attempted to seize one of the few intact bridges over the Lys River, but faced staunch resistance. Only with the reinforcement of the French vanguard were they able to cross the river after a fierce struggle. They then moved towards Ypres, which surrendered, while smaller towns endured harsh looting. Van Artevelde led his troops west to confront the French, and on November the 26th they established a camp south of the village of West-Rosebecke, or Rosebecke in French. Positioned on a high ridge shielded by forests, the Flemish erected defensive fortifications and formed a dense formation behind them. The French camp was situated just 6 miles south of this crucial position, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation. As the troops advanced in 3 separate divisions towards the base of the hill, the scene was set for a fierce confrontation. The infantry dismounted, bracing themselves for the impending ascent. With the morning mist gradually dissipating, they charged forward, only to be met with a relentless onslaught of projectiles and artillery fire from the defending Flemish foot soldiers. The French troops, heavily armoured and expecting an easier victory, were taken aback by the steadfastness of their adversaries. Despite the chaos and danger, the Flemish soldiers held their formation admirably, surpassing the expectations of the French forces. The battle took a dramatic turn as the French centre was pushed back by the unyielding barrage of arrows and cannon fire, causing them to retreat. However, the flanks of the French troops managed to outmaneuver the enemy by scaling the hill and launching a surprise attack on the unprotected rear of the Flemish forces. This strategic move caught the townspeople off guard, leading to panic and disarray among the Flemish ranks. They began to break formation and attempt to flee through the French lines, only to be mercilessly pursued and massacred by the mounted soldiers. The aftermath of the Battle of Ruzebeke was grim, with a staggering count of 27,000 Flemish casualties, including the prominent figure of Van Artevelde among the fallen. The majority of the casualties were a result of the chaotic retreat, with many being trampled by their own comrades. In the end, only a few pockets of resistance remained, and they were swiftly eliminated by the victorious French forces. The defeat marked the end of the rebels' resistance, with severe punitive measures imposed on the surrendered towns. Count Louis was reinstated on the throne, albeit with significant French influence, while only Ghent persisted in its rebellion for a while longer, before reaching an amnesty agreement with the new Duke Philip the Bold. The repercussions of the battle were felt not only in Flanders, but also in France, where the victory emboldened the king and royal princes to assert greater control over rebellious towns, imposing heavier taxes through royal decree. The disagreement between the Scots and the French during the war highlighted differing strategies. The Scots favoured quick raids focused on seizing cattle, while the French aimed for town conquests to control resources. This led to a split within the army, with the French advancing along the Tweed River to raid coastal lands up to Morpeth. However, they were forced to retreat when faced with a strong English force led by Richard. The unsuccessful Scottish invasion made it clear to the French court that maintaining an invasion force in the Scottish countryside was challenging, prompting them to halt further attacks from Scotland. In 1386, John of Gaunt's failed invasion of Castile diverted the French court's attention from launching a direct assault on England in 1386 and 1387. The English, on the other hand, achieved victories by plundering French trade fleets. By 1388, both sides had depleted their reserves, leading to peace negotiations as internal discord grew in both realms. The late 1380s saw significant political transformations, with both monarchs asserting their authority independently. Charles V of France began personal governance by replacing Valois nobles with his father's former advisors, known as the marmosets. Meanwhile, Richard II's rule in England descended into despotism, sparking internal conflicts. Amid these political changes, Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son, was exiled from England in 1399. Gaunt's death and Richard II's decision to prolong Bolingbroke's exile and seize his duchy of Lancaster led to his return to England. Landing at the Humber estuary in June, Bolingbroke quickly gained support from Richard's disgruntled nobles. Richard, who was in Ireland, was deposed and later died in captivity. The House of Lancaster rose to power as Henry IV took the throne as the usurping patriarch. The start of Henry IV's rule as a Lancastrian monarch faced immediate challenges, with uprisings erupting to resist his reign. The shifting political landscape and internal turmoil in both England and France during this period underscored the complex power struggles and conflicts that defined this era. Owain Glyndwr's rebellion in Wales marked the beginning of a turbulent period, which was followed by Hotspur's uprising, led by a Percy family member. Despite Henry of Monmouth's crucial role in quelling the insurgents at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, the Welsh defiance persisted, leading to further revolts in the early 15th century. King Henry IV's declining health further complicated governance, allowing his son, Henry of Monmouth, to showcase his administrative skills and leadership qualities by taking on more responsibilities as his father's health deteriorated. In France, the House of Valois faced its own challenges as King Charles VI's madness created a power vacuum. Louis the Duke of Orléans seized control, continuing the conflict with England while expanding his personal wealth and influence. The rivalry between the Valois and the Burgundians intensified, with John the Fearless inheriting the Duchy of Burgundy after Philip the Bold's passing. John, known for his military expertise and administrative prowess, played a crucial role in the power struggles within the French realm, navigating the complex political landscape with his exceptional capabilities. The initial conflict that erupted between John the Fearless and the Duke of Orléans can be traced back to their differing views on crucial policy issues, which ultimately led to violent clashes. John's support for the Roman Pope and opposition to prolonging the war with England clashed with Orléans' allegiance to the Avignon papacy and advocacy for continuing the conflict. This stark divide in opinions resulted in the formation of factions around each leader, Louis gathering supporters known as the Armagnacs, and John garnering backing from the Burgundians. The tension between these factions reached a boiling point on November 23rd, 1407, when the Duke of Orléans was assassinated on a Parisian street, sparking a bitter civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians. After orchestrating a successful coup in Paris, John the Fearless found himself besieged by the Armagnacs in 1411 under the leadership of the Duke of Berry. Seeking aid, the Duke of Burgundy struck a deal with Henry IV of England, offering territorial concessions in exchange for support. English forces intervened and broke the siege, but John's oppressive rule alienated the people of Paris, leading to his expulsion from the city in 1413. Meanwhile, the Armagnacs consolidated their control over various regions, while significant events unfolded in England with Henry IV's death in March 1413. His son, Henry V, ascended the throne and underwent a transformation from a reckless prince to a decisive monarch, prioritising justice and order in his administration. Henry V's reign was marked by a strong commitment to Christianity, exemplified by his fervent religious beliefs and his willingness to take severe measures when necessary. In response to a plot by his former friend John Oldcastle, Henry ordered the burning alive of Oldcastle and his followers, underscoring his dedication to upholding the law and ensuring order in his realm. His primary goal was to reclaim lost territories and rights, showcasing his resolute governance style and determination to maintain stability within his kingdom. In the latter part of 1414, a significant diplomatic mission was sent to Paris to engage in peace talks. However, the terms proposed by King Henry V were considered excessive by the French delegation. Henry demanded the full reinstatement of the 1360 Treaty of Bretigny, the return of England's territories in Aquitaine, Poitou and Ponthieu, settlement of outstanding funds from Jean II's ransom, a hefty sum of £330,000, annexation of Normandy, Maine and Anjou, an overlordship over Brittany, Flanders, Beaufort and Noailles. While Henry's goal was to reclaim English territories in France, the unrealistic demands may have been deliberately crafted to be rejected. Unsurprisingly, the French refused these terms, leading to a resumption of hostilities. The Dauphin of France, Louis of Guyenne, even sent a mocking gift to Henry, taunting him with little balls to play with and soft pillows to sleep on. In response, Henry vowed to awaken them from their comfort with early morning door poundings. Subsequently, orders were issued to assemble the largest English army since the Battle of Crécy. Around 320 captains were enlisted to recruit troops, marking a shift towards a more organised approach to raising forces in England. After quashing a rebellion plot and executing its leaders, Henry V, accompanied by his troops, departed from England on August 11th, 1415, on a fleet of nearly 700 ships. Sailing on the 500-ton flagship La Trinité with his advisors, they landed on the Normandy coast near Chef-du-Caux 3 days later. Instead of launching a destructive campaign as previous kings had done, Henry chose to march towards the strategically important port of Harfleur, establishing his base at the Priory of Graville, with the expectation of a swift surrender by the small garrison. Encircling the town of Estouteville stood formidable ancient walls, constructed in anticipation of an impending English invasion that had seemed inevitable. The Lord of Estouteville, fearing the worst, took additional precautions by sealing off the harbour and flooding the plain to the town's north, cutting off potential avenues for attack. To bolster the defences, reinforcements led by Raoul de Gaucourt arrived, adding 300 men at arms to the existing garrison of 100 defenders, which included crossbowmen and brave local residents willing to fight for their home. Henry executed a strategic manoeuvre by positioning himself to the town's western flank, while deploying his brother, the Duke of Clarence, to the east. The siege was initiated after the steadfast refusal of the town to surrender to the English demands. The English forces wasted no time in setting up batteries and bombarding the defences relentlessly, while the defenders valiantly repaired breaches and launched daring counterattacks to keep the assailants at bay. Despite the defenders' skillful thwarting of English mining attempts and efforts to raise the water level of the River Lizard, the English forces managed to breach the outer defences, causing damage to towers and walls and depleting food supplies within the town. The French leaders, however, displayed unwavering resolve, holding off the English offensives for a fortnight before being forced to reluctantly consider the possibility of surrender as their situation became increasingly dire. Ultimately, the city of Estouteville was handed over to the English monarch as per the terms of surrender, with surviving garrison members and fighters being held for ransom. The courageous resistance put up by the small garrison managed to stave off the English king and his forces for a commendable 6 weeks, during which time the English army struggled with outbreaks of malaria and dysentery, further highlighting the resilience and determination of the defenders in the face of overwhelming odds. During the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the troops were meticulously prepared for combat, fully aware of the historical significance of the impending conflict. The English forces, under the command of the charismatic Henry V, were confronted with the daunting prospect of facing off against a formidable French army that had gathered in Rouen, led by the Dauphin. Adding to the complexity of the situation was the presence of John the Fearless, whose intentions to join the battle against England threatened to sow discord within the French ranks. The Duke of Burgundy's refusal to provide support only served to heighten the tensions within the French leadership, creating a sense of unease and uncertainty on the eve of the battle. As the campaign unfolded, suspicions of potential collaboration with the English forces lingered among the French commanders, particularly in relation to Burgundy. The delays encountered at Harfleur forced Henry V to make a critical decision, whether to retreat to England without achieving his objectives, or to push forward towards Calais, facing the challenges of marching with a depleted army. Ultimately, he chose to follow in the footsteps of his great-grandfather Edward III, embarking on a perilous journey through Normandy and Ponthieu towards Calais. The English troops encountered numerous obstacles along the way, including treacherous river crossings and the constant threat of French patrols disrupting their progress. As the English army approached the Somme at Blanchetaque, they were met with a formidable obstacle in the form of the French advance guard, strategically positioned to impede their crossing. Forced to rethink their strategy, Henry V led his troops upstream to cross at Nesle, only to discover that the main French army had already gathered near Peronne, ready to engage them in battle. Despite facing immense challenges such as exhaustion, hunger, and dwindling supplies, the English soldiers persevered, continuing their march towards the north. Finally, on October 23rd, they reached Blangy, where they were met by the entire French army, positioned ominously on a raised ridge, setting the stage for the historic Battle of Agincourt, as the English King Henry V stood with his formidable mounted knights and men-at-arms, meticulously organising his forces into battle formation. The scene was nothing short of awe-inspiring. The French, after an intense, hour-long standoff, eventually retreated and settled for the night near a charming hamlet called Agincourt. It was on the evening of October 24th that King Henry issued a stern decree for silence to reign over the English encampment. A stark contrast to the joyous revelry that filled the rainy night air in the French camp nearby. The battleground, where both sides would clash, the following morning was a marshy field that had recently been ploughed, bordered by thick forests. Despite the odds stacked against them, Henry V's reduced army, consisting of approximately 8,500 soldiers, was strategically imbalanced, with a majority of 7,000 skilled archers and a mere 1,500 dismounted knights and men-at-arms. Due to the limited size of their forces, the English army was arranged in a compact battle formation. Positioned at the heart of the formation were three tightly knit divisions of melee infantry known as battles, interspersed with units of longbowmen. The left battle was under the command of the experienced Baron of Camoys, the right led by Edward, Duke of York, while King Henry himself oversaw the central division. Additional archers were evenly distributed on both flanks, with a significant number strategically concealed in the dense surrounding woods. The archers were under the leadership of Sir Thomas Erpingham, ensuring that they were well positioned to provide crucial support. To fortify their defences, a protective barrier of stakes and caltrops was erected, serving as a deterrent against any potential cavalry charges. On the opposing side of the field, the Grand French Royal Army, boasting a formidable strength of approximately 20,000 soldiers, was under the joint command of the somewhat uncertain Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, both seasoned officers overshadowed by high-ranking nobles. Their army deployed in three distinct tiers, with the first two tiers predominantly comprised of France's proud, dismounted knights and men-at-arms, poised to deliver a powerful assault against the English forces. The rear tier consisted mainly of archers and crossbowmen. Flanking the infantry were around 750 heavily armoured cavalry knights on each side, with additional troops steadily joining the French ranks. Learning from past defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, the French leadership opted for a more cautious approach, choosing to hold their ground rather than immediately charge. D'Albret and Boucicaut were keenly aware that as time passed, the English forces would dwindle, while their own army would only grow stronger. Despite any advantages it may have had, the cautious approach taken by the restless knights and nobles of France left them frustrated. Realising that the French were not going to make the first move, Henry V understood the importance of taking action before it was too late. Therefore, following detailed discussions with his seasoned commanders, the king issued orders for his entire army to remove their defences and advance methodically. Reports say that he inspired his troops with a simple yet powerful rallying cry, urging them forward with the words, "Fellas, let's move." Once within range of their longbows, the army skillfully repositioned their defences, and the English archers unleashed a relentless barrage of arrows on the unsuspecting knights in the front. The chaotic scene caused panic among the hastily assembled French cavalry units, driving them to charge headlong at Henry's forces in a desperate attempt to regain control. Erpingham, known for his strategic prowess, signalled for the archers to draw their bows and wait as the French knights approached through the muddy field. At the critical moment, he bellowed, "Now, fire!" prompting the archers to release a devastating volley of bodkin-tipped arrows at close range from both the front and the tree line. The sky was momentarily obscured as hundreds of knights and their steeds fell under the piercing arrows. Those who managed to break through found themselves impaled on sharp stakes or forced to retreat back to their own ranks in disarray. Simultaneously, a band of opportunistic peasants and cavalry, led by a few Burgundian nobles, seized the opportunity to pillage Henry's supply train, making off with valuable loot such as bedding, cash reserves, and even one of his crowns, although this did not have an immediate impact on the battle. Meanwhile, D'Albret's first line of infantry laboured through the muddy terrain, further impeded by the chaos left in the wake of the failed cavalry charge. The unfavourable conditions, combined with heavy armour and disrupted formations due to the retreating cavalry, left the French vanguard vulnerable to the deadly accuracy of the English longbowmen, who inflicted significant casualties with each expertly aimed volley. Despite facing adversity, the elite French forces clashed with the thinly spread English line, initially pushing them back before meeting fierce resistance from Henry's resolute men-at-arms. A fierce melee erupted at the front, with the second line of French infantry advancing but encountering a bottleneck near the vanguard, which hindered full engagement and impeded the retreat of frontline troops. As the battle raged on, the French suffered losses, while Henry's infantry, engaged in close combat, bore the brunt of the fighting. In a particularly intense section, Edward, Duke of York, fell in the midst of the struggle, and Henry V himself narrowly escaped death, sustaining damage to a part of his crown, as the archers on the flanks maintained their position. Henry V's resounding victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 had far-reaching consequences for the French army. The aftermath saw the English capturing a significant number of prisoners, ranging from high-ranking figures like the Dukes of Bourbon and Orléans, to common soldiers. Fearing potential uprisings among the captives, the English took drastic measures by ordering their archers to execute the majority of the prisoners. This ruthless act struck fear into the hearts of the retreating French forces, leaving them in a state of despair and disarray. Following his triumph at Agincourt, Henry V orchestrated a grand display of power by compelling the captured French aristocrats to serve at his banquet table before his departure for England. This symbolic gesture further highlighted the devastating blow the French defeat had dealt to the country, plunging it into a state of vulnerability and internal turmoil. Henry wasted no time in capitalising on his victory, immediately making preparations for future military campaigns. He focused on securing funds, mustering troops, and organising a navy in anticipation of launching an assault on France. As Henry set his sights on the conquest of Normandy, he received unexpected support from the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who formed an alliance with the English against France. This new alliance proved instrumental in securing further victories for Henry, notably the decisive defeat of the Franco-Genoese naval forces. This victory paved the way for the English army to march into Normandy, where they conducted successful sieges on strategic cities like Caen and Rouen. The fall of Normandy under English dominance for the first time in 200 years caused alarm among the Armagnacs and Burgundians, who recognised the growing threat posed by Henry's expansionist ambitions. Despite engaging in secret negotiations with Henry V, the Burgundians ultimately realised that complete English conquest would not align with their interests. This realisation led to the signing of the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a pivotal moment in the 100 Years' War. The treaty solidified Henry's control over France and marked a significant turning point in the conflict, setting the stage for further English advancements on the French soil. In the midst of escalating tensions, John the Fearless and the future Charles V of France found themselves reluctantly engaged in negotiations. However, the Duke of Burgundy's act of submission to the Valois prince took a tragic turn when Armagnac supporters of Charles launched a vicious attack, resulting in John's untimely death as retribution for a past offence. This incident, irrespective of the motives behind it, left a lasting impact on France. Centuries later, Francis I, upon encountering the mutilated skull of the deceased Duke, somberly remarked, "This is the breach through which the English infiltrated France." The news of John the Fearless's brutal demise sent shockwaves of chaos and fear rippling across various regions of the kingdom. Philip, the grieving son and heir of the Duke of Burgundy, reacted with a potent mix of sorrow and anger. Driven by a fierce determination to avenge his father's death, Philip forged a strategic alliance with Henry V of England, with the Duke of Burgundy acknowledging the English monarch's claim to the French throne in exchange for territorial gains. This pivotal alliance marked a significant turning point, as the war fatigued Charles VI of France, grappling with deteriorating mental faculties, reluctantly acquiesced to the terms of the Treaty of Troyes on May 21st, 1420. This treaty effectively designated Henry as the heir and regent of France, cementing his marriage to Catherine of Valois and ensuring their offspring's place as future monarchs. In the aftermath of securing key towns loyal to the Dauphin, Henry V celebrated Christmas in Paris before journeying back to England to crown Catherine as his queen. Meanwhile, the Duke of Clarence suffered a fatal defeat at Beauge in March 1421, prompting Brittany to defect Despite this setback, Henry successfully reclaimed several castles in France before laying siege to Meaux, where he fell ill but remained resolute in staying with his troops until the city's surrender in May 1422. Faced with declining health, Henry V made arrangements for the succession, appointing Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, as regent in England, and entrusting his brother, the Duke of Bedford, with governing in France on behalf of the infant King Henry VI. The illustrious Lancastrian monarch of England, a pivotal figure in the nation's history, passed away at Vincennes on August 31st, 1422, at the youthful age of 35. Just 2 months later, the ailing King Charles VI of France drew his final breath, paving the way for his son's ascent to the throne. However, the territories north of the Loire remained under Anglo-Burgundian control, while the new king only managed to maintain allegiance in the southern regions, where he established a temporary court. The Battle of Verneuil in 1424 ensued following the signing of the Treaty of Amiens in 1423, shaping the complex web of alliances and conflicts in this tumultuous period. In July of 1423, the English forces took strategic action by fortifying their defences north of the Loire River and launching sieges on fortresses aligned with Charles. This move prompted an army supporting the Dauphin, which included soldiers from Scotland, Italy, and Spain, to march through Burgundy's lands to support their allies. However, this coalition suffered a significant defeat at Crevant against a combined English and Burgundian force. Concurrently, in the western region, a Norman garrison loyal to Charles successfully repelled an English marauding expedition at La Brossinière, showcasing the ongoing back-and-forth struggle for control in France during this period. By the spring of 1424, the Dauphin's forces in France received a reinforcement of 6,500 Scottish troops, swelling their ranks. Led by the Count of Aumale, the Dauphin's army attempted to lift the English siege at Ivry Castle, but found the English position too strong to overcome. The focus then shifted towards Verneuil, where additional troops from Italy joined the fray. The English, under the command of Bedford, formed a formidable alliance with these troops on August 17th for a crucial battle. At Verneuil, the English army, numbering around 8,000 soldiers, faced off against a French force of 14,000 to 16,000 troops, including Scottish archers, Lombard knights, and Spanish fighters. The English deployed infantry and archers with stakes for defence, while lightly armoured soldiers safeguarded their supply convoy. On the French side, a significant portion of their cavalry dismounted, while the Lombard knights remained mounted, presenting a diverse and complex battlefield dynamic. The clash at Verneuil saw the Lombard mercenaries launching a bold charge against the English forces, prompting a swift response from the English archers. The French surprised their opponents by organising their ranks in a frontal assault rather than flanking manoeuvres, setting the stage for a fiercely contested battle. This engagement at Verneuil exemplified the contrasting tactics and strategies employed by the English and French armies as they vied for supremacy on the battlefield. Clad in formidable Italian armour, the knights surged through the English ranks with a fierce determination, their swords flashing as they cleaved through the enemy formation, leaving a trail of fallen soldiers in their wake. The Milanese cavalry, a force to be reckoned with, relentlessly pursued the baggage guard, driving them away from the chaos of the battlefield. Under the strategic command of Bedford, the English troops swiftly regrouped, their ranks bolstered by the valiant French and Scottish allies, who fought alongside them in a infantry showcased their martial prowess, further reinforced by the devastating accuracy of the longbowmen whose arrows shattered the French defences, causing significant losses to the enemy forces. The Lombards, upon their return, were met with a resounding defeat, their hopes of a French victory dashed as they found themselves swiftly repelled, with many of their prominent nobles taken as prisoners of war. The crushing loss at Verneuil dealt a severe blow to the aspirations of Charles VII, forcing him to re-evaluate his military strategies, while Bedford's influence and reputation soared to new heights, driving the momentum of his campaign forward with renewed vigour. The challenging siege of Orléans commenced in 1428 under the strategic planning of Salisbury, who devised a meticulous plan to capture the city and weaken the formidable forces of the Dauphin. Victories in capturing multiple towns and fortifications paved the way for the English army to encircle Orléans, defended by a mix of battle-hardened soldiers and determined local militia. With the successful securing of Jargeau and Châteauneuf, the English effectively cut off all supply routes to the city, tightening the noose around the defenders. Salisbury orchestrated a relentless artillery barrage and led a daring assault on the heavily guarded gatehouse, overcoming initial setbacks with unwavering determination. Deploying skilled sappers to undermine the fortified structures, the English forces applied relentless pressure on the defenders, forcing them to retreat deeper into the city, prolonging the grueling stalemate. Despite setbacks caused by Gloucester's errors that necessitated Bedford's temporary return to England, the strategic mastermind swiftly resumed his campaign in France in 1427 with a clear objective: the capture of Orléans, a pivotal stronghold that would greatly influence the course of the ongoing conflict. On the fateful evening of October 23rd, a critical section of the bridge, located behind the soldiers, suffered significant damage, sparking fears of impending disaster for Orléans. The aggressive Salisbury, deeply involved in strategizing the next move, was struck by a cannonball, leading to severe injury and ultimately his demise a week later. The Earl of Suffolk, stepping into his shoes, opted for a strategy of prolonged siege as Orléans ramped up its defences, taking proactive measures by setting ablaze and demolishing the outskirts beyond the protective city walls. As the calendar turned to November 8th, English ships began the arduous task of ferrying troops across the Loire River to secure strategic siege positions, prompting feeble French attempts at counterattacks. By December, the besieging forces had fortified their positions, focusing primarily on the northern bank and launching unsuccessful assaults on Port Renard in the new year. Despite a successful supply convoy reaching the city and a segment of the garrison uniting with a French contingent at Blois, a French assault near Rouvray in February, spurred by intelligence on an enemy supply caravan, led to significant casualties. In the face of mounting challenges, a young maiden named Joan emerged as a beacon of hope, driven by divine messages and unwavering faith in her sacred mission. Her arrival on the scene promised to inject renewed strength into the French cause, even as significant events unfolded miles away. Charles, grappling with the looming threat of the great city's fall, contemplated the unthinkable act of relinquishing his kingdom, but Joan's presence loomed large, poised to reshape the course of history and turn the tides in favour of the French forces. Leading an army against the English was a monumental task for Joan of Arc, as her mission was not just to relieve Orléans, but also to have the Dauphin traditionally crowned as Charles VII in Rouen Cathedral. The historical significance of this coronation, taking place where Louis the Pious, ascended to the Frankish throne 6 centuries earlier, added a layer of importance to Joan's noble cause. With the support of Robert de Baudricourt, a pro-Valois commander in Vaucouleurs, Joan embarked on a perilous journey that took her from Chinon to Poitiers, where her unwavering faith was affirmed. Her purity and divine mission were confirmed, setting the stage for her legendary feats. Equipped with armour, horses, a distinctive banner, and a legendary sword she had supposedly unearthed, Joan's journey to Orléans was not just a physical one, but also a spiritual and symbolic one. Her arrival in Blois and subsequent joining of the relief force transformed the atmosphere among the French soldiers and officers, inspiring them to rally behind Joan's patriotic cause. The respite in Orléans after Rouvray allowed the English forces to fortify their positions in anticipation of the incoming relief attempt led by Joan and the Dauphin's army. The new English commander, Glasdale, fortified Les Tourelles, turning it into a formidable citadel with external defences. Joan's departure for Orléans on the 26th marked a significant turning point in the siege, as her miraculous crossing of the Loire at Chessy and entry into the city through the Burgundian Gate boosted the spirits of the besieged citizens. Upon her arrival, Joan wasted no time in taking action, demanding the English to lift the siege from the Bellecour stronghold. Despite being initially dismissed by Glasdale, Joan's resolve and threat to execute all captured prisoners if her demands were not met forced the English to comply. A skirmish broke out when La Hire advanced against the northern English fortification at Saint-Pouer, but the defenders were eventually repelled. Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orléans, left the city to seek reinforcements, leaving Joan to bolster the city's defence efforts. Her military reconnaissance and morale-boosting activities paved the way for a renewed defence when Dunois returned, reinvigorating the besieged citizens' hopes for a successful outcome. On the eventful 4th of May, a surprise attack unfolded on the eastern fort of Saint-Lô in England by a reinforcement of 1,500 soldiers. The news quickly reached Joan of Arc, prompting her to ride out and join the fray. During the intense 3-hour battle, Joan's leadership and encouragement proved crucial in motivating her troops. Despite facing formidable opposition, the French forces managed to capture and demolish Saint-Lô, sparking jubilation among the people of Orléans. Joan couldn't help but shed tears for the fallen English soldiers who perished without absolution. The urgency of breaking the siege before the arrival of a significant Anglo-Burgundian relief army, led by John Fastolf, was not lost on the commanders, pushing them to expedite their efforts. Crossing the Loire, the French soldiers set their sights on Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, engaging in a relentless struggle until they eventually overwhelmed the stronghold. The assault on the outer defences of Les Tourelles on the 7th initially faced stiff resistance, resulting in significant casualties among the French ranks. Despite being struck by an English arrow during the battle, Joan remained steadfast and unwavering in her commitment to the cause. After a brief moment of prayer for guidance, Joan resolutely returned with her standard, rallying the French troops for one final push that successfully ousted the besiegers from the fortification. Even after Joan's call for Glasdale to surrender, he adamantly refused and attempted to lead his men across the drawbridge, leading to numerous soldiers drowning in the process. With morale plummeting within the inner fortress, the remaining English forces quickly surrendered. Positioned on the northern bank of the Loire, the English troops abandoned their siege positions and regrouped for battle. As Joan and the other military leaders readied themselves for combat, the besieging forces, faced with their resolute determination, ultimately lost their resolve and retreated from the battlefield. As the army continued its march, the decision was made to split into two groups, one to head to Jargeau for garrison duty, and the other to fortify Mons. These strategic moves were met with fierce resistance from French troops, who refused to adhere to orders and relentlessly pursued the English forces. Despite the challenges and attacks they faced, the army persevered, culminating in the end of the siege of Orléans after 210 days. Joan of Arc's bravery and leadership during this time solidified her place in history as the Maid of Orléans. Following the victory, Joan was eager to march and crown Charles immediately, but French leaders hesitated due to the English strongholds still present along the Loire. Eventually, in mid-June, the army, with Joan at their side, began reclaiming these fortresses one by one, including the fall of Jargeau, Beaugency, and Mons. However, the remaining English troops, under the leadership of Talbot and Fastolf, regrouped and joined forces to counter the French advances. Despite Fastolf's warnings to proceed with caution, Talbot and his subordinates were determined to assist the fortresses along the Loire, leading to a confrontation near the village of Patay. The English forces, caught off guard by a French ambush, faced a fierce battle that resulted in the capture of many of their leaders. Sir Fastolf was among the few who managed to escape with a portion of his troops, marking a significant turning point in the conflict. The Battle of Patay in 1429 marked a significant turning point in the 100 Years' War, as the French forces, led by the Dauphin and Joan of Arc, achieved a decisive victory over the English. The English suffered heavy casualties and were unable to withstand the strength of the French cavalry, leading to the crumbling of the myth of English military invincibility. This triumph emboldened the French army as they continued their advance towards Reims, culminating in the coronation of Charles VII in the city's cathedral. The ceremony, with Joan of Arc prominently displaying the sacred banner, served as a potent propaganda tool for the French cause, rallying support for the new king. As the political landscape shifted with Charles VII's coronation, the English regent in France, John of Bedford, fortified Paris in preparation for potential attacks from the French forces. When the French did eventually launch an assault, Bedford successfully repelled them, showcasing his tactical prowess. Meanwhile, Joan of Arc's capture by the Burgundians and subsequent condemnation as a heretic and execution cast a shadow over the French morale. Despite her unparalleled role in boosting the spirits of the French people, her tragic fate at the stake in Rouen left Charles VII facing challenges in maintaining unity and momentum within his ranks. The dynamics of the conflict evolved as Bedford managed to stabilise the region around Paris, while also ensuring the symbolic crowning of Henry VI of England as Henry II of France. The Duke of Burgundy, adept at playing both sides, engaged in strategic truces with the Armagnacs, further complicating the already intricate web of alliances and loyalties. Military operations in the years following the Battle of Patay centred primarily around Paris, with sieges and surprise attacks characterising the ongoing struggle for dominance in the region. The intricate dance of power and politics continued to shape the course of the 100 Years' War, with each side vying for control and supremacy on the battlefield. The French launched multiple offensives to disrupt the communication lines between Paris and Normandy and along the Normandy main border. They specifically targeted various forts to weaken the English hold on these strategic regions. On the other hand, the English were facing significant challenges due to financial constraints and a shortage of manpower. Their struggle to defend the extensive 350-mile front in France, maintain modern warfare techniques involving gunpowder siege numerous garrisons put a strain on their resources. Despite these difficulties, the territories were held largely due to the leadership skills of Bedford and the support he received from the Anglo-French coalition. While there were some minor successes in reclaiming rebellious Norman castles in 1434, the ongoing rebellion was draining vital resources from the occupiers, leading to a deteriorating situation on the ground. The turning point came in 1435, when Charles VII's forces achieved significant victories over the English, consolidating their control over key regions such as Picardy. The capture of Saint-Denis and Moulins further encircled Paris, disrupting crucial supply routes and causing food prices to skyrocket in the capital. This unrest culminated in a siege on Paris, where Armagnac and Burgundian forces joined hands to reclaim the city on April 13th. The English garrisons soon departed, and the Armagnacs also made gains in northern Normandy by capturing important coastal towns like Dieppe and Harfleur, which were vital for English campaigns on the continent. Despite the Duke of Burgundy's attempt to besiege Calais in 1436, an English relief army under Beaufort managed to maintain control over the town for another century. In 1437, Talbot led a final offensive along the Seine, managing to secure parts of Upper Normandy and recapture Pontoise. However, English military strategy was showing signs of weakness at this point, as the ongoing conflict and resource drain were taking a toll on their operations. The shifting dynamics in France, with the French forces gaining momentum and securing key victories, posed a significant challenge to the English presence on the continent. Maintaining control over their territories in Normandy was of paramount importance for the English, especially as the French forces were steadily advancing and capturing one castle after another along the border. By the time Henry VI emerged from his minority to rule independently in 1437, attempts to negotiate peace in 1439 had failed. England's position on the continent continued to deteriorate over the following years, with unsuccessful operations in Picardy and Normandy, although they did manage to successfully recapture Harfleur. However, English strongholds in the French crown lands, such as Meaux, Creil, Pontoise, and Evreux, fell to Jean Bureau's formidable artillery. Gascony faced its first significant assault in decades, with English forces besieging Tartas, but ultimately falling to Charles VI's counterattacks. Despite various efforts by the English, including sieges in Dieppe and a venture into Anjou, as well as peace talks and reforms from 1441 to 1445, little progress was made. A faction within the English court, led by the Duke of Suffolk, pushed for peace with France and held considerable sway over King Henry VI. In 1444, Suffolk led an embassy to Tours for negotiations, proposing a truce that could be extended in exchange for Henry VI's betrothal to Charles VII's niece, Margaret of Anjou, and the cession of Maine to France. While this peace agreement brought relief to English settlers in northern France, who were facing increased French incursions, it sparked outrage in England and played a role in triggering the Wars of the Roses. As Henry VI's kingdom faced internal turmoil, Charles VII of France used the truce to implement significant military and financial reforms that transformed feudal France. The land tax, known as the taille, which had been sporadic in the past, became a permanent fixture to fund the king's initiatives. Instead of disbanding armies annually, a new system was introduced in 1444, where only lower-ranking units were released, while elite troops formed the core of a standing army. On January 5th, 1445, the French royal government officially established Compagnie d'Ordonnance, regular military units supplemented by the best routiers and écorcheurs, many of whom were discharged mercenaries paid monthly to ensure loyalty, discipline, and high morale standards. This marked a significant shift in the French military structure and heralded a new era of military organisation in the kingdom. Charles VII of France implemented a multifaceted approach to modernise the French military, which included innovative strategies to enhance the army's efficiency and effectiveness. One of the key tactics he employed was the recruitment of skilled former independent soldiers, a move that not only helped in reducing criminal activities within the realm, but also utilised the expertise of these individuals for the benefit of the army. In contrast, Charles viewed the disreputable écorcheurs as obstacles to achieving peace and stability in the region. Additionally, the king embraced advancements in gunpowder artillery, such as the adoption of crumbled gunpowder, which significantly improved the reliability and performance of the weaponry used by the French forces. The contributions of the Bureau brothers played a vital role in standardising cannons and elevating the level of training and professionalism within the military ranks. The tensions during the French reconquest of Normandy from 1448 to 1450 intensified as the forces led by the Duke of York clashed with the French troops. The garrisons in Maine, which were under York's command, staunchly resisted abandoning their fortified positions, leading to a heightened risk of renewed hostilities. With the English forces gradually weakening, York was reassigned to govern Ireland, and Somerset assumed his role in France. The conflict escalated when François de Surienne launched an attack on a Breton fortress with English support, prompting Brittany to seek assistance from Charles the Bun. The French army successfully captured several castles, triggering a standoff over the proposed exchange of Fougères for other towns, a proposition that was ultimately turned down, further fueling the ongoing conflict between the opposing sides. The conflict that erupted in July escalated as Charles VII took direct command of the French forces in southern territories, launching a series of successful offensives against English strongholds in Normandy. The French quickly gained momentum, capturing key towns like Pont-Audemer and Mantes, while Breton troops secured the Cotentin Peninsula and the Duke of Alençon reclaimed his city. The siege of Rouen in October marked a significant victory for the French, further consolidating their control over the region. Throughout the winter, French forces continued their advances, reclaiming important channel ports like Harfleur and Honfleur, significantly diminishing English control in Normandy to a small central western portion. On the English front, Queen Margaret and Suffolk's efforts to assemble a substantial army for deployment to Normandy faced challenges, including delays due to a shortage of ships and the onset of winter. The troops' discontent grew with delayed wages and Suffolk's mismanagement, culminating in his tragic assassination during an escape attempt. Despite these setbacks, Sir Thomas Kyriel eventually led the English reinforcements to Cherbourg in March, providing much-needed support to the English forces in Normandy. The arrival of Kyriel's army, along with reinforcements from nearby garrisons, boosted morale among the English troops, as France reinforced its own positions at Valognes, setting the stage for further confrontations in the ongoing conflict. Reinforcements were urgently dispatched by King Charles VII to assist Jean de Clermont, his trusted commander, after the castle's surrender to the English forces led by Kyriel. The English army, under Kyriel's skilled leadership, executed a strategic manoeuvre through the challenging tidal marshlands near Granvey, encountering minimal resistance from the local population. Setting up a well-fortified camp at Formigny, Kyriel's troops prepared for the imminent confrontation with the French. Clermont, aware of the English army's movements, swiftly reached out to Arthur de Richemont, the Breton constable of France, for additional support. As the French troops mobilised under de Richemont's leadership, Kyriel's forces wasted no time in fortifying their position at Formigny in anticipation of the impending battle. With the French army approaching, Kyriel strategically deployed his troops, positioning archers on the right flank and assigning Goff to lead additional forces on the left near the Val stream. The Battle of Formigny erupted as Clermont led the French forces into a fierce clash with the well-prepared English army. Despite efforts to reinforce his troops, de Richemont's delayed arrival on the battlefield led to him missing the initial engagement. Kyriel's forces, strategically arranged in battle formation, engaged in a fierce and intense struggle with the French army for control of the village and its surroundings. The outcome of the battle remained uncertain, as both sides fought fiercely for dominance on the battlefield. As the sun reached its zenith, a group of skilled artillerymen advanced towards the battleground, expertly guided by a distinguished Scottish unit leading the march. Upon reaching the Val, they made a strategic decision to halt roughly 600 metres away from their foes, ensuring they stayed out of range of the deadly longbows wielded by the English. Safely positioned at a distance, the French troops gathered on the western side of a bridge that separated them from their adversaries. For a span of 3 intense hours, Clermont's soldiers stood their ground as their commander sought advice from his trusted advisers. The experienced captains counselled caution, while the younger officers urged for a swift assault to prevent the English fortifications from strengthening. Clermont, who would later be known as the fearsome scourge of the English, initiated the conflict by deploying 2 light cannons along with a small group of crossbowmen and men-at-arms. The unexpected artillery barrage inflicted significant casualties on the unsuspecting English troops. In a swift response, Matthew Gough commanded 500 archers to cross the bridge and launch an aggressive attack on the French gun emplacement. The archers successfully drove off the French gunners, seized the cannons, and neutralised the defenders. Startled by this setback, Clermont directed local peasants to scour the southern countryside in search of de Richemont, urgently needing reinforcements. Simultaneously, Clermont dispatched a larger group of men-at-arms, led by Pierre de Breze, to bolster their beleaguered comrades and engage the enemy forces. Despite the early advantage favouring the French under Clermont's leadership, Kyriel reinforced Gough's troops, gradually turning the tide in favour of the outnumbered English forces. In subsequent official reports to the French monarchy, drafted soon after the battle, it was noted that if Kyriel's army had launched a full-scale assault at that critical moment, Clermont would have likely faced defeat. However, such a decisive move never came to pass. As the conflict unfolded on the central front, a contingent of approximately 1,000 soldiers appeared on the plateau to the south of the battlefield. Initially interpreted as reinforcements for the English, the impending threat soon became apparent to both sides. The arrival of Arthur de Richemont's forces, posing a significant risk of a rear attack on Kyriel's troops. De Richemont quickly rode with his advance guard to confer with Clermont, while the main Breton force remained positioned on the English side of the Val. Strategically challenging for Kyriel's forces, the English likely still held the advantage in numbers over either French commander. In response, Sir Kyriel ordered Gough's unit on the left flank to reposition, turning to face de Richemont's main army to the south. Seizing the moment, the elite Breton vanguard successfully crossed the bridge, engaging in fierce combat adversaries and inflicting heavy casualties on the opposing soldiers. Disrupting Gough's redeployment plan, the Breton constable regrouped with his main army and strategically marched northeast towards the English rear. At the same time, Clermont launched a fierce attack on the English front lines, catching them off guard. Pierre de Breze, demonstrating his tactical prowess, led a group of soldiers to swiftly seize control of the eastern fortifications, effectively cutting off any chance of a meaningful retreat for the English forces. Despite Sir Thomas Kyriel's valiant efforts to rally his disorganised troops in the village, the surprise attack from behind by Breze's forces, coupled with assaults from both main armies, proved too much to handle. The chaos escalated as even the local villagers joined the fray, further contributing to the destruction of the main English army. In a harrowing retreat, only Gough and Robert Vere managed to lead their remaining soldiers back to safety in Bayeux and Caen, while a group of longbowmen faced a brutal end at the hands of Clermont's troops in a nearby garden near the Val. Sir Thomas Kyriel, along with approximately 1,200 others, was captured, while a staggering 3,800 of his men met their demise at Formigny, effectively shattering England's military ambitions in Normandy. The resounding defeat of Kyriel's army, a composite force drawn from various garrisons, left key locations vulnerable and defenceless. Capitalising on this opportunity, France swiftly seized control of Vire, Avranches and Bayeux on May 16th. The siege of Caen followed, culminating in its fall and subsequent conquest in June, as Charles XI made a triumphant entry into the city on June 6th. Cherbourg, the last stronghold, succumbed on August 22nd, 1450, marking the complete French dominance over Normandy for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The loss of Gascony during the French reconquest from 1449 to 1453, spearheaded by the Duke of Somerset, dealt a severe blow to England, pushing the nation towards internal discord. Post-victory, France shifted its focus southwards to Gascony, successfully capturing several cities and fortresses in the region, with Charles' allies, notably the Count of Foix, playing a crucial role in seizing strategic locations like Guiche and other castles. The historic English territory of Gascony presented a formidable challenge in terms of conquest and governance, marking a stark contrast to the relatively easier control over Normandy. The loyalty of the Gascon merchants and nobles to their traditional leaders during the period from 1445 to 1449 was primarily driven by the economic prosperity they were experiencing through trade, particularly with the export of wine to England reaching unprecedented levels. The aristocracy and inhabitants continued to show allegiance to their superiors as they were reaping substantial profits and were hesitant to disrupt the established order. The French military's offensive on Gascony, starting with the fall of Cherbourg in October 1450, marked a significant shift in power dynamics. The swift capture of Jonzac and subsequent victories against Anglo-Gascon forces showcased the French forces' strength and strategic prowess. The seamless progression of the conquest, including the capture of key fortresses like Blaye, Bourg, Saint-Emilion and Castillon, was facilitated by the French artillery and diplomatic strategies, as well as the use of bribery to weaken resistance. The turning point came on June 23rd, when Bordeaux surrendered without a battle, followed by the fall of Bayonne, leaving the English forces disunited and unable to hold onto their continental territories, except for Calais. The French, however, made a crucial mistake by imposing heavy taxes on Gascony to fund its defence, leading to immediate discontent among the populace, while the English were not prepared to give up Gascony without a fight. Internal political issues and military delays hindered their response. Richard of York's involvement in the uprising against Henry VI in Ireland further complicated the situation, as he returned to England with the support of rebels, challenging the Queen's administration. The confrontation at Dartford between York and the Lancastrians highlighted the growing tension, with York presenting demands that included the arrest of the Duke of Somerset for mismanagement in the French defence efforts. As time passed, the feeble king initially gave in to the demand, only to later be convinced by Margaret of Anjou to reverse his decision and reaffirm his loyalty to the crown. Somerset was then given the responsibility of governing the realm. In the meantime, an army of approximately 3,000 soldiers was assembled under the leadership of the 65-year-old John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, through indentures. The situation in Gascony had become tumultuous, leading to envoys arriving in London in 1452, inviting the English back and offering assistance upon their return. After English ships demonstrated dominance over their French counterparts at sea, Talbot boldly sailed to Gascony and landed on the Medoc Peninsula on October 17th. Following an orchestrated uprising against the French in Bordeaux, the city surrendered within days. By the end of the year, most of the fortresses in western Gascony had fallen, with only a few exceptions. This unexpected offensive by Talbot caught Charles VII off guard, as his forces had been redirected to Normandy in anticipation of a potential invasion there. During the winter, the English received reinforcements of 4,000 troops and supplies from home. In response to the Gascon betrayal, Charles quickly dispatched advanced troops south to reinforce the remaining French-held castles, while preparing to lead an incursion into the rebellious province himself. In early June of 1453, 4 separate armies began to congregate at different points along the Gascony frontier in preparation for a multi-front invasion. 2 armies in the south assembled in Languedoc, led by the Count de Clermont and Gaston IV, the Count of Foix, who stationed his troops near Béarn. In the north, a 3rd army under the command of Marshals de Gélande and Loyac, ready to march from the vicinity of Angoulême. Charles VII oversaw a reserve army strategically positioned in the Lusignan region. The French monarch ensured that all contingents were well equipped with siege weapons and gunpowder artillery, placing particular emphasis on the northern force at Angoulême, accompanied by his artillery master, Jean Bureau. The coordinated French advance began in early June, with armies in the south moving north toward Bordeaux, while the northern army made deliberate progress through the Dordogne Valley towards the city of Castillon. Foix and Clermont, working closely together, responded to Talbot's call for battle, causing the English commander to retreat to Bordeaux. The 2 French forces then positioned themselves near the city to anticipate any English counter-offensive. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation as the French armies strategically positioned themselves in Gascony. In the midst of the hot July days in 1453, Charles embarked on a significant military expedition towards Castillon, a modest town guarded by a handful of soldiers. His formidable army, consisting of approximately 8,000 well-trained troops, was well equipped with advanced weaponry tailored for siege warfare. Rather than opting for a traditional encirclement tactic, the skilled strategist Jean Bureau chose to position his forces strategically at the Priory of Saint-Florent and constructed a sturdy artillery base on the expansive and open plain of Colle. setting the stage for a crucial confrontation. Simultaneously, in the bustling city of Bordeaux, Talbot was hastily summoned to reinforce the English garrison stationed at Castillon. Despite facing logistical challenges and facing a race against time, Talbot marshalled a diverse contingent of infantry, Gascons, and mounted cavalry to march towards the besieged town. Upon launching a surprise assault on the French projectile troops stationed at the priory, Talbot's forces managed to glean vital intelligence regarding Bureau's artillery emplacements, gaining a crucial strategic advantage in the unfolding conflict. Following the initial skirmish, Talbot wisely chose to grant his troops a well-deserved respite before orchestrating a meticulously planned, large-scale offensive manoeuvre. In stark contrast, Bureau swiftly dismounted his cavalry and meticulously organised his soldiers for an impending clash as they drew closer to the priory, emboldened by their previous success on the battlefield. The stage was now set for a decisive and potentially game-changing confrontation between the English and French armies at the pivotal battleground of Castillon, with both sides meticulously fine-tuning their tactical strategies and battle formations in anticipation of the looming showdown. The scene on the battlefield was chaotic as the grooms deftly guided the horses away, their hooves kicking up a thick cloud of dust that billowed behind them. This clever manoeuvre was a strategic ploy to mislead the English scouts, who were left believing that the French forces were retreating. Talbot, a seasoned commander known for his bold decisions, received word of the supposed retreat and, against the advice of his men, decided to press on with the attack. The allure of potential plunder in the enemy camp drove Talbot to lead his army towards Bureau's stronghold, with the cavalry units at the forefront and foot soldiers marching closely behind. As the English forces approached the fortification, the French scouts quickly spotted them and hastened to inform Bureau of the impending threat. Bureau wasted no time in deploying his artillery park, strategically placing cannons on the ramparts to counter the English advance. Despite being without armour due to a vow he had taken, Talbot made the bold call for his soldiers to dismount and engage the enemy on foot. While some advisers, like Everingham, suggested laying siege to the position, Talbot, concerned about his reputation and eager for a swift victory, opted for a direct assault. The initial charge, led by Everingham, unfortunately resulted in heavy losses, including the tragic death of Everingham himself, further fueling the intensity of the battle. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Gascon infantry, forming the bulk of the English forces, launched a gradual assault on the fortification's right flank. The arrival of reinforcements bolstered the spirits of Talbot's men, sparking a ferocious offensive, despite the relentless barrage of fire from the French artillery. Despite their superior numbers, the English troops encountered fierce resistance from Bureau's well-fortified defences, leading to a prolonged hour of brutal and inconclusive fighting atop the ramparts. The clash of these two determined forces created a tense and gripping spectacle on the battlefield, with neither side willing to yield ground easily in the face of such fierce opposition. The conflict's escalation reached a critical point when the Breton forces arrived at the battleground, having been forewarned earlier in the day. Their well-timed assault on Talbot's right flank, supported by mounted troops, caught the English forces by surprise, throwing them into disarray. In the chaos of battle, Talbot sustained serious injuries, and the French, seizing the opportunity, launched a devastating counter-offensive that further weakened the English defensive line. Despite the dire situation, Talbot managed to rally a small group of soldiers to hold the rear as the rest of his forces began to retreat. Tragically, A cannon projectile struck Talbot's horse, causing the noble knight to be fatally trapped beneath the fallen steed. In a poignant act of bravery, Talbot urged his son to flee to safety, but the young man defiantly chose to stand by his father's side and met his fate alongside him. The aftermath of the battle was grim for the English forces, with many soldiers perishing in their attempts to cross the Dordogne River, while others fell to the relentless Breton cavalry. The Anglo-Gascon casualties numbered between 500 and 4,000, a stark contrast to the relatively minimal losses suffered by the French. In recognition of Talbot's valour and loyalty, Jean Bureau orchestrated an elaborate funeral with full military honours, presenting Talbot's standard and chain of command to King Charles VII, who expressed his gratitude for the fallen knight's unwavering dedication. The Battle of Castillon, on July 20th, marked a turning point, with the French monarch personally leading his troops to a decisive victory. Following the fall of Bordeaux, Gascony faced continued resistance, but eventually succumbed to Charles VII's forces. After enduring a 10-week blockade, Bordeaux finally surrendered on October 19th, 1453, forcing the English to retreat from Gascony. The far-reaching consequences of these events reverberated across both England and France, shaping the course of history in significant ways. The 100 Years' War, which effectively concluded in 1453, marked a significant turning point for England, as it shifted from having a European presence to becoming solely insular. The war may have officially ended, but tensions between England and France persisted, with French privateers continuing to harass the English coastline. To counter these threats, significant garrisons were established in key regions like Normandy and Gascony to deter further English incursions and maintain control. The formal conclusion to the hostilities came in 1475 with the signing of the Treaty of Picquigny between Edward IV of England and Louis VIII of France. Initially meant as a temporary ceasefire, the treaty evolved into a lasting peace agreement that effectively ended the conflict. This peace endured for almost 2 decades, until 1492, during which time no English monarch made serious attempts to reclaim the French crown. The last remnants of English control in France, such as the Pale of Calais, were relinquished in 1558 during the Italian Wars, when French forces seized control. In the aftermath of the 100 Years' War, England faced internal turmoil, particularly during the Lancastrian monarchy following Henry V's death. The reign of Henry VI was plagued by court conflicts, leading to a power struggle between Richard of York and Edmund of Somerset. This internal strife culminated in the War of the Roses, which began with the Battle of St. Albans in 1455. The situation worsened when Henry VI fell into a catatonic state in late 1453, intensifying the political unrest and setting the stage for further conflicts within England. In a previous video, the intricate origins of the conflicts that eventually led to the Civil War were meticulously examined. These conflicts were found to have deep roots that can be traced back to the 100 Years' War and its profound financial and territorial consequences. By delving into Edward III's decision to establish duchies for his sons, it became apparent that the resulting accumulation of wealth and authority among his heirs posed a significant threat to the king's power, ultimately setting the stage for the civil strife that followed. Furthermore, while King Charles VII of France managed to successfully expel the English from the continent, he continued to face challenges such as local supporters aiding English incursions and internal discord, which perpetuated his feelings of insecurity. Throughout this tumultuous period, the various provinces and their rulers often prioritised their own interests over the unity of the kingdom, potentially leaving themselves vulnerable to manipulation by the English. To combat this looming threat, King Charles VII took decisive actions that included the execution of a Gascon noble for colluding with the English and the confiscation of lands from nobles suspected of conspiring against the monarchy. Additionally, Louis X played a pivotal role in advancing the centralisation drive by curbing the autonomy of appanaged nobles and making efforts to annex rival duchies like Brittany and Burgundy. The influential Burgundian dukes, Philip the Good and Charles, emerged as formidable obstacles to French royal authority as they forged alliances with the English and incited rebellions against the crown. With the decline of the Burgundian house in 1477, the French crown seized the opportunity to absorb their territories, sparking a prolonged conflict with the Habsburg dynasty. The inclusion of Brittany and the reintegration of other princely regions into the royal domain further cemented the monarchy's control by the end of the century. The Formigny Treaty served to diminish the capacity of princes to pose external threats to the king, while instances of treason highlighted the diminishing political freedoms of the nobility. Despite noble attempts, such as those by Charles of Bourbon during the Italian Wars, to challenge the monarchy, the lack of support from their peers ultimately thwarted their endeavours. Although the French nobility still retained some influence, the monarchy's consolidation of power through centralisation measures and strategic alliances reshaped the political landscape, tipping the scales of authority in favour of the crown and altering the dynamics between the monarchy and the aristocracy. Following the death of Henry II, the political landscape of the nation once again plunged into turmoil, this time due to religious divisions instigated by powerful noble families. The French monarchy, seizing the opportunity of newfound stability and authority, initiated foreign military campaigns that set off a 60-year power struggle against the Spanish imperial von Habsburg dynasty for control over Italy and Europe. The transition from a feudal to a centralised system became increasingly apparent, particularly in areas such as taxation and military recruitment, a transformation that unfolded not only in France but also across much of Western Europe and played a significant role in shaping the destinies of both England and France. In the 1430s, King Charles V of France implemented measures to strengthen taxation by calling for the General Estates to convene annually for tax collection. By 1439, he solidified royal authority by decreeing that only the king could raise troops and levy taxes, directly challenging the autonomy of rebellious princes who attempted uprisings such as the Braguerie in 1440 and the Nevers gathering in 1442. Charles effectively enforced continuous taxation throughout his reign without seeking approval from the estates, utilising financial mechanisms like aids and taille post-war to fund his endeavours. Furthermore, during a period of truce in the 1440s, Charles IX established the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, professional standing armies funded entirely by royal tax revenue, which later formed the nucleus of the military forces that clashed with nobles in the 1460s and 1480s and launched an invasion of Italy in 1494. While England had already made strides towards centralisation before and during the conflicts, the authority of the Parliament expanded as monarchs sought to increase tax revenues, thereby maintaining a system of checks and balances on royal power that persisted in the centuries to come. Unlike other European nations that began developing standing armies in the 16th century, England, owing to its insular location and pre-existing centralised structure, did not raise a permanent army until the era of Cromwell. The emergence of gunpowder and the growing significance of cannons in siege warfare during the 100 Years' War marked a pivotal shift in military tactics. This protracted conflict not only fostered a stronger sense of national identity in both England and France, fueled by mutual animosity and increased involvement of the populace through heavy taxation and widespread recruitment of archers, but also contrasted sharply with the sentiments prevalent in regions like Burgundy. In just one generation, the English aristocracy abandoned French, their traditional language, in favour of English, underscoring the evolving cultural dynamics within the nation. France, on the other hand, boasted a rich historical heritage that continued to influence its political and social landscape as it navigated through the challenges brought about by shifting power dynamics and emerging centralisation trends. In the centuries that followed, the once prominent regional distinctions that impeded the authority of the French monarch gradually dissolved amidst prolonged periods of conflict and upheaval. This gradual erosion paved the way for the central government to extend its influence to the farthest corners of the realm, solidifying the French national identity through a tumultuous blend of warfare, looting, and subjugation. Initially met with resentment, the military forces eventually became the unifying force against the perceived common enemy. The English, after the pivotal Battle of Agincourt, leaving lasting emotional scars on French society. The devastating repercussions of the Black Death left a profound mark on both France and England, setting the stage for renewed hostilities during the Lancastrian era. The northern regions of France became battlegrounds, leading to prolonged periods of recovery as villages were decimated and once thriving fields succumbed to encroaching forests. Fortified cities bore the brunt of destruction, with their outskirts in ruins and an influx of displaced individuals seeking shelter within their walls. While some urban centres swiftly recovered from the aftermath of conflict, many areas continued to grapple with the lingering effects of devastation for years to come. In stark contrast to France, England emerged from this tumultuous period relatively unscathed, despite facing occasional coastal raids and the persistent threat of Scottish invasions. The decline of the wool trade, a crucial source of revenue under the English Crown's control, prompted a reassessment of England's foreign policy. The 100 Years' War, a defining conflict of the medieval era, featured monumental battles, charismatic leaders, and far-reaching consequences that reverberated across Western Europe, shaping the trajectories of both France and England. France emerged from the conflict with a strengthened state apparatus, solidifying its position as a key player in European diplomatic affairs for generations to come. During the subsequent centuries, England found itself becoming more isolated on its island as its ties to the neighbouring continent grew weaker and weaker. This increasing sense of solitude was exacerbated by a combination of political, economic, and cultural factors that gradually eroded the country's connections with the rest of Europe. As England's relationship with the continent became more tenuous, it began to assert its independence and develop a unique identity that set it apart from its European neighbours. This shift towards isolation had far-reaching implications for England's development and influence on the world stage, shaping its trajectory in ways that would resonate for centuries to come. The growing sense of isolation also fueled a sense of national pride and identity among the English people. as they forged a distinct path for themselves, separate from the influences of the continent. This period of increasing solitude marked a pivotal moment in England's history, leading to the emergence of a nation that would eventually become a global powerhouse with its own unique place in the world. And that, dear listeners, concludes our tranquil journey through the 100 Years' War. From the initial sparks of conflict to the final treaties, we've witnessed how this war altered the course of history. I hope you found this exploration as captivating as I did. Thank you for joining me here on the ASMR History channel. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more whispered tales of the past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what historical periods or events you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the echoes of history. Sweet dreams, and goodbye.